Chapter 793. Don't hit me, I remember now, there seems to be such a thing. Sheeta hurriedly grabbed his head with his short baby fat hands and screamed, I'll tell you, I did steal their things, but those guys are a bunch of paupers, they don't have anything good to eat at all. The little female dragon grabbed the back of his neck in annoyance and pulled him back, interrupting, Who asked you this? Tell us, where is that Surash? Oh no, I really don't know that guy you're talking about. Little fat dragon staggered from the pole and kept shrinking his neck. He shouted in frustration, Really, I promise, I swear on the third scale of Lord Bahamut. The dragon god doesn't want a disgrace like you, let's see if you still dare to play tricks. Alas, that's enough. Brando had to stop this farce. You let go of Sheeta, I have a question to ask him. The little female dragon replied bluntly, Why should I listen to you? Although she said that, she still let go of Sheeta. The poor latter was dizzy from being shaken by her, and it took a while for him to recover. Sheeta took a deep breath, and finally understood that his future employer seemed to have some weight in front of Alaz, the female dragon. A kind of slippery nature bred in him immediately wanted to hide behind Brando, but just as he was about to move his short legs, Alaz glanced at him with her golden eyes and froze him there in fear. Brando pretended not to see this guy's little move. Sheeta, you said you don't know Surash? Then the existence that made a contract with you, who is that? No, that's not the same thing at all. The one that made a contract with me, but... The frost dragon suddenly stopped. But... Alaz revealed her white and dangerous fangs. No. Sheeta hurriedly waved his short fat hands. I mean actually, that thing you're talking about, it's not that I don't know. Then why are you still keeping us in suspense? The grumpy little female dragon lifted her little leather boots and kicked him. Wow! Sheeta dodged with an agility that did not match his size. He screamed, I'm not trying to keep you in suspense. It's just that I'm not sure. Sheeta, speak your mind. Looking at Alaz and Sheeta playing around in front of her, Veronica frowned and had to take the initiative to speak up. These two dragons' concept of time made her a little annoyed. She did not know if this was a side effect of their long lifespan, or the dragons themselves were dismissive of these insignificant dangers. Because the log said that there was a red pillar of fire. I saw it too. I remember that it was around the time of the Year of Thunder. Whenever night fell, a pillar of fire would appear and rush into the sky, forming a golden vortex above the clouds. How long did it last? Brando continued to ask. Half a year. This scene continued for half a year before it gradually stopped. Little fatty dragon replied quickly, but I really don't know what that is. Such a risky thing, I don't want to go near it. This is surprisingly in line with your cowardly style. Come on, eat my claw. Alaz commented sarcastically. This is not cowardice, this is wisdom. A gentleman does not stand under a dangerous wall. Wah! Before little fatty dragon could finish his sentence, he was almost scratched in the face by Alaz's sharp nails. Veronica looked back. Behind her, after experiencing the encounter with sabers, the arrogant cruise people seemed to have finally learned to restrain themselves. The noble officers had become unusually careful and cautious at the moment. Their faces were more or less pale, perhaps due to the cold or perhaps due to fear. But the female legion commander really paid attention to Brando. Little guy, how is it? Lady Veronica, I'm not as wise as the Aeneas friar Perseus. Brando seemed a little helpless about the female legion commander's blind trust. The memory of his previous life was not always applicable in this sparse information of the holy cathedral of the hibernator. Even he could only speculate with his experience. But he thought about it and replied, But I have some ideas. Veronica looked at him with her emerald green eyes and playfully raised her curved eyebrows at him. Unfortunately, the female legion commander's subtle action, which was extremely inconsistent with her age and identity, was only noticed by Brando alone. The Year of Thunder lasted for about half a year, which was surprisingly consistent with the time described in the log. Brando pondered for a moment. Although there were some differences in the description, he was at least 80% sure that what Sheeta described was the same thing that the faraway eagle commander saw when he was young. He ended his thoughts and looked up. Sheeta, let me ask you, do you still remember the direction in which the pillar of fire rose at that time? Sheeta was dodging Alaz's attack, so he replied noisily, It's from the northeast. I still remember the flame I saw that night, it appeared in the northeast night sky. My dear lord, call Alaz away, she's going to bite me. The night sky in the northeast? Brando turned a deaf ear to the little fat dragon's cry for help. He subconsciously looked in that direction, and in his field of vision were layers of ice and deep darkness. But the next moment he seemed to remember the place. It's actually there. You have an idea? Veronica observed the subtle changes in the young lord's expression. Brando shook his head. He did not expect it to be in that place. The place Sheeta described was far away from the core area of the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator. There was spiral black ice there, so it was called the Spiral Hall. But the Spiral Hall was only a side hall of the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator. There was nothing there, only some icy breath blocking the way. The breath of ice was a kind of magic that was awakened and animated by dark magic from the ancient battlefield. It was one of the many monsters in the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator. Brendel remembered that the drop list of this monster was quite good, so many players came here to farm it. It was the periphery of the temple, and there was no need to enter the time quasi-seal in the center of the dungeon. The difficulty of the monsters was moderate, and there was no threshold. At least thousands of players had explored this area, so there was no reason why there were secrets that had not been discovered by the players. Could there really be some oversight? Brando could not help but be confused. What's going on, little guy? What are you embarrassed about? Veronica asked. Well, Brando also came back to his senses. There's good news and bad news. What's the good news and the bad news? Can you tell us, Count? Miss Scholar was always full of curiosity about such riddles and could not help but interrupt. The bad news is that Erek is likely to not have to pass through the time quasi-seal in the center of the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator at all. My previous predictions were wrong. He may even bypass the maze and go straight to his destination. Shido looked a little worried. Then what's the good news? The good news is that I happen to know where that place is, and I even know a shortcut that can save us a lot of time, Brando said with some hesitation. In that case, what are you still hesitating about? Veronica looked at him, puzzled. What I'm hesitating about is that all of this is based on my own judgment. If my judgment is wrong, then we may not have time to make up for this mistake. Brando took a breath. You're worried about this? Veronica looked at him incredulously. What do you mean I'm worried about this? Isn't this a problem worth worrying about? Brando looked at the others with some puzzlement, because almost everyone looked at him as if they had heard some funny joke. Count Tonagel, along the way, I haven't seen you make a mistake in judgment. I don't understand why you're questioning yourself when things have come to a head. But I'd rather believe in my own eyes and believe in what I've always seen. I believe you must have your own reasons for this judgment, Count. Shido could not help but answer loudly. Miss Scholar stared at him very seriously. Brando was speechless. His previous judgment was correct because he still had the memory of his previous life. But the deeper he went into the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator, the less information there was on the forum. After that, he had to rely on his own judgment. But he was very clear about the limits of his ability. In the past, the level 130 warrior player in the Amber Sword was not even a first-tier player in the game, let alone the top. His personal combat power was very outstanding, but it was limited to the upper echelons. Some of the characteristics of the top professional players, excellent judgment, and the decision-making power to lead a team or even a guild, as well as the crazy flash of inspiration, he did not have them. And what was this place? This was the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator, a team dungeon that represented the peak of an era in the game. Such a team dungeon, even the first-tier players did not dare to set foot in it. Anyone who could conquer it was the top in this field. Those were the IDs whose names were engraved on the wall of brilliance of the Amber Sword. Brando could still remember those names. If he thought that one day his name could be on par with them, it would undoubtedly be too arrogant. He had such perseverance and willfulness, but some things depended on talent. If Sheeta had told him that the place Erek was going to was Frost Square, or even the core hall of Sehes, he would have led the team there without hesitation, because these two places were also recognized as the most likely places to hide the awakening god. Or take a step back, the Ring Serpent Hall, the control desk, was also acceptable. But it was the Spiral Hall, a place that had been trampled by thousands of people, and there was nothing worth mentioning except for the breath of ice. But the question now was, should he choose to believe his first instinct or more rational judgment? For the first time since coming to this world, Brando began to feel a little headache. He couldn't help but look at the others, but everyone was looking at him, waiting for him to make a decision. Including Cruz's people, almost everyone had unknowingly gotten used to the feeling of being ordered by this lord. As long as someone could lead them to victory, who cared if they were Cruz's people or Erwin's people? Only one voice echoed in the ice cave. With all due respect, Count Tonagel, although I don't understand what you are hesitating about, I want to ask, other than that, do you have a second judgment for us to choose? The one who spoke was the eldest prince of Cruz's people. He glanced at Brando and asked so coldly. Brando was slightly startled. Lenoret is right, Brando. If there is no better choice, then we can only choose a relatively good judgment. Veronica also said, besides, I don't know why you are suddenly confused. You have never been wrong in your judgment, and I believe this time is no exception. After that, she added, you're not going to trick me, are you, little guy? Brando couldn't help but smile bitterly. It wasn't certain who would trick who. If Erek really detonated the thing in his hand, whether it was the awakening god or the twilight seed, he was afraid that they would all be turned to dust. At that time they would naturally be annihilated as well. However, Cruz had lost the first-in-line heir they had painstakingly cultivated, and he was afraid that they would not let it go so easily. Besides, if Haruz died here, Princess Griffin would hate him to death. There was also the little Roman. Brando thought of the little cloth merchant and couldn't help but smile. I hope so. He finally nodded, I can only promise to do my best. He raised his head and ordered Medisha not far away, Medisha, check the condition of the siblings. We'll take them and get ready to go. The silver fairy princess smiled and nodded, yes, my lord. Brando turned his head, somewhat distracted. Even though the spiral hall was a side hall, it was still considered within the holy cathedral of the Hibernator. Even if they took a shortcut, it was inevitable that they would encounter a battle. This had already deviated from his original plan. He originally thought that Erek would be blocked in the hall of the Hibernator. This time, the only boss he intended to challenge was Sheeta, who was already on their side, but the current situation was obviously far beyond his expectations. Was he really going to take such a group of people to challenge the central dungeon of the Deadly Frost Forest? Brando couldn't help but look at the others. In the distance, the Cruz nobles were whispering. It seemed that they were not preparing to better carry out his orders. Seeing such a scene, he couldn't help but sigh, and his heart was even more uncertain. P.S. Okay, I finally found the feeling. I'm going to die. By the way, I'll recommend a book to everyone. The author of the book is an idiot, but the book is not bad. The key is that the updates are quite fast. The author will be on the list tomorrow. I'll also help count the votes and opinions. Speaking of which, when I saw the speed of others' updates, I suddenly felt a burst of shame. I was spurred on. The title of the book is Disaster Descends. The book number is 2959961. The portal is as follows. http://www.chidian.com book 2959961. SPX I don't know if it can be used. Chapter 794. Just as Brando was heading towards the spiral hall, a group of exhausted knights were passing through the shimmering ice forest. The forest was silent in the world wrapped in silver. Every branch that grew from the snow-white trunks was as fragile as glass. With a light touch, it would completely turn into powder with a crack. Heavy footsteps came from afar, and the varying depth of the footsteps showed that the owner was nervous. Then came the rustling sound of insects crawling under the grass, but it was actually the soft footsteps of some kind of four-legged beast. Damn it! The young knights of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment gritted their teeth and cursed as they turned around and pulled out their longswords. The next moment, demons with white fur emerged from the darkness. They were snow-white wolves, all white except for a pair of cold eyes that flashed with a yellow light. The wolves passed through the thorny forest, growling as they attacked the knights from all directions from the bushes under the snow. At that moment, time seemed to stand still. On one hand there were the growling winter wolves and on the other hand there were the roaring knights. 15. 7 over here. The winter wolf's pouncing movement froze in the cold air, and then a narrow and bright blade pierced its throat. The white beast rolled over and fell to the side of the bushes. The knights took a step back in unison, leaving a long row of corpses quietly flowing with dirty black blood. Black smoke rose from the bodies of the monsters and disappeared in the blink of an eye. The wolves were like a rolling wall of snow as they passed over the corpses of their own kind. They growled and stood side by side, their silver fur moving without wind. Accompanied by the low growls of these demons, the dark magic in the forest was gathering at a speed visible to the naked eye. The magic formed intertwined blue curves, and then condensed into crystal ice prisms. The ice prisms were suspended in the air for a moment, and the next moment they came like a storm. Mashai-zan. With a hoarse roar, one halo after another unfolded from the knights of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment. The knights waved their long swords and smashed the icicles into pieces. A few icicles passed through the gaps between the blades and hit the halo on the armor, shattering into pieces and exploding into a cloud of ice mist. Brund frowned and punched the winter wolf's open bloody mouth, almost knocking it back with a punch, splashing blood and broken teeth. Then he turned around and slashed at the face of another winter wolf that was waiting for an opportunity to pounce on him, leaving a wound that was so deep that the bone could be seen. The beast whimpered and fled with its bleeding wound, disappearing into the darkness in the blink of an eye. Ha! Aaliyah's rough laughter came from one side. Brund looked in that direction and saw that his companion's mouth was full of blood. He had actually bitten a wolf to death. He laughed loudly and said, "They bite me, I bite them. What is fairness? This is fairness. That's why I like to fight. Here everyone is equal regardless of background." Brund. His neck was wrapped in thick gauze, he was swaying and his face was as pale as paper. Blood continued to seep out from where he was injured last night, but this did not stop his violent temper and loud voice. In fact, someone had stopped him from getting up from the stretcher to participate in the battle. Brund frowned. "Where is your upbringing, Aaliyah?" "I only have upbringing for upbringing. Who would talk to a dog about upbringing?" Aaliyah replied indifferently. "This is not a dog, this is a wolf." Rollo corrected. "It's all the same." Brund was too lazy to pay attention to these two guys. He shook off the beads of blood flowing on the dark steel blade and looked around. The forest was like a dark hole of illusion. The shadows of white beasts far and near were everywhere. And in the farther direction, the elegant stag was resting on a snow-white rock, as if waiting for them to move on. Since tracking it, they had been trekking in the snow for hours on end, and the winter wolves had been tracking them in the forest all night. Everyone was cold and sleepy, relying only on their willpower to support themselves. Like the Erewhon people, the Cruise people were superstitious that these rare and elegant creatures in the forest would bring good luck, and the stag did lead them all night to find a path to move forward in the dark forest, as if they were blessed by the gods. However, the good times did not last long. At this moment, the sky was gradually brightening, and the first rays of dawn appeared on the eastern horizon. Everyone could see a long white wall in the sky a few miles away. A glacial cliff stretched across the canopy of the forest, its crystalline ice surface sparkling under the morning sun. The glacier pressed heavily on Brund's chest, making his heart pound. Was there really a way ahead? Freya panted slightly, her bright light brown eyes were also full of doubts. "Ladies, I'm afraid there's no way ahead. What should we do next?" A knight of the Folded Sword Regiment shouted. "No way, the glacier can't be endless. Since the stag has brought us here, it means there must be a way to get around it." Little Pero replied. The sickly young Cruise man was wrapped in a thick bearskin coat, holding a rapier in one hand and a crossbow in the other, but he was not inferior to his companions in battle. Many winter wolves had fallen at his feet, and every wound was a fatal blow. Seeing that the others had shifted their gaze to him, Little Pero continued to answer slowly, "As long as we find the natural edge of these broken glaciers. Will there be?" Freya could not help but blurt out and then covered her mouth. Such unconfident words did not seem to come from the mouth of a commander. "There will be." Little Pero only glanced at Freya and replied with certainty, "If it is indeed a naturally formed glacier." "What if it isn't?" Aaliyah stepped up 2 steps to catch up from behind, just in time to hear the conversation. The sickly young man glanced at him and did not answer. Aaliyah opened his mouth. He was not afraid of Brund, who came from a great aristocratic family, and could even be neither servile nor overbearing in front of the eldest son of the emperor. But only in front of Little Pero he could not lift his head like a mouse seeing a cat. Even he himself could not figure out the reason. But that did not mean that his big mouth could stop talking. He thought for a moment and complained, "If you ask me, we shouldn't have trusted a stag. I really don't know what's going on in your heads." "I'm sorry, this is my decision." Freya stood up and replied. "I'm not targeting you, Sir Commander. I'm just a little surprised that so many of us seem to be possessed, and no one raised any objections at the time." Aaliyah replied. The commander lady from Erewhon was far less powerful than them, and her tactical level could only be said to be average, but that did not mean they could not disrespect her. If it were not for the investigation of the cause of Anika's death, she would not have fallen into a trap and fallen into this situation. At least she had the awareness and courage of a commander, which was a feeling they often felt from Veronica. This is the strange part of the whole thing. After repelling a wave of attacks from the winter wolves, Brund also came over. "Aaliyah, we Cruise people and Erewhon people grew up listening to the legend of the stag. The stag in the dark forest is the same as the unicorn, the embodiment of kindness and order. They once guided the Flame King and Eric, and today they have come to guide us again. You did not stand up against it at the time because you agreed with this from the bottom of your heart." "Nonsense." The rugged knight curled his lips. "Aaliyah, it's understandable that you Aenir people have never heard of the legend of the stag." Brund chuckled. "But you have to admit that there are some mysterious and inexplicable things in this world. Only then did Freya notice that Aaliyah did seem to have some Aenir blood, as evidenced by the light blonde curly hair and long and narrow nasal cavity. He also had a strong local accent when he spoke. This knight looked like he was from Fanzan or a race further north. But Aaliyah jumped up as if he had been poked in the foot. "Brund, what do you mean by that?" "As I said, if you were a little more confident, you wouldn't treat your origin and bloodline as an attack," Brund replied nonchalantly. "Umph." The former snorted heavily but did not answer. Freya had become accustomed to the quarrel between the two men this night, but even if they were to argue for a reason, it would not help to solve the current predicament. What they had to do now was to completely curb the attack of the wolves. In any case, we have to defeat them first, then bypass the glacier and continue north. Freya paused and said to the others, "If possible, meet up with Brando and Lady Veronica. But it's too difficult to get rid of the wolves in the forest." Rollo frowned and shook his head. "How do you know if you don't try?" Aaliyah turned back and replied nonchalantly. "You don't know wolves, Aaliyah, you don't know how cunning they are." "That's natural, I'm not a mountain man, how would I know these beasts?" He spread out his hands in amusement. The dark-skinned mountain knight stared at the former without saying a word. "Exactly," the girl from the countryside of Bucci pulled off her cloak. "That's why we need to fight back. We can't get rid of them if we get entangled with them, we have to take the initiative to attack and defeat them until they don't dare to chase us anymore." Little Pero saw Freya tying her cloak to a spear and immediately understood what she was thinking. "It's too risky. If you risk exposing your position, maybe the silver monster is lying in ambush, it's obviously coming for you." Freya hesitated for a moment. "There's no way to think about it anymore, we're all exhausted, I don't want to be driven forward by the wolves like this, waiting for death when we're too tired to walk." She raised the flag in her hand. "I'm the commander and I'll lead everyone to break through the encirclement. If I fall, you will take over my flag and pass the information of the monster to Brendel and Lady Veronica. You're just an apprentice commander." A slightly cold voice came from behind, and then Freya felt someone holding the spear in her hand. She was slightly startled and looked back to see Maynard's expressionless face. "Senior Maynard? Leave the flag to me." The black-haired female knight gently took the simple battle flag from her hand. "You give the order." "Senior? Don't talk nonsense, give the order." Freya took a deep breath, she looked back at the others and little Pero and Brund both nodded to her. Her gaze swept across the undulating forest and snowfield, and she had a plan in mind. Descendants of the Flame King, the Knight of Cruz, with the flag as the center, the two wings close to the center. The girl's clear voice rang through the forest, and all the knights of the Folded Sword Regiment turned their heads in amazement. A silver flag had been erected in the forest, it was clearly a cloak that fluttered in the morning breeze. The cloak was also embroidered with the emblem of the White Lion. "Knights, prepare to attack. P.S. This chapter is a little less laggy, I'll try to speed up the update. Also, I'll continue to recommend Blackie's new book, Cataclysm Descends, book number 29599961. It's still a new book at the moment, please help support it, those with votes vote, those without votes click on it." Chapter 795. The snow-covered woodland seemed to have experienced a fierce battle. The snow and bushes were full of corpses of winter wolves. The corpses were turning into black particles, dissipating like black smoke. The victors of the battle obviously belonged to the other side that was not lying on the battlefield, the human knight from Cruz. Joachim looked at this scene expressionlessly, while slowly moving along the open space between the woodland. Katja, a leather boot stepped into the snow. "Damn it!" Joachim cursed in a low voice. He frowned, lifted his foot, took off his boot, patted the boot to shake out the snow inside, and then put it on again. A grayish-white winter wolf came out of the bushes and whimpered a few times at him. Joachim looked up and rubbed his chin. "About a quarter of an hour? They have fled to the north?" "Who are they, the people from Cruz?" "I think so, there is no one else in this forest except them. Don't worry, they are just stubborn. They can't run far." The winter wolf whimpered in a low voice. Joachim seemed to understand what the beast wanted to express and stroked its forehead with his hand. Although he was no longer as arrogant as he was in Ampere Seal, he had indeed been killed once in that war. He had died under the swords of the disorderly soldiers when he was fleeing, and the injury he had suffered at that time had left an indelible scar on his body. Right now, his skin was as white as paper, lacking luster and moisture. His exposed arms and palms were so shriveled that they looked terrifying like skeletons. One of his eyes was permanently blind, so he wore an eye patch with a hollow skull pattern on it to cover it. There was also a fatal wound on his chest, caused by a heavy sword that had not healed yet. The gap under the wound led to the ribs and pierced his heart, but the heart that was once born as a human had long decayed and no longer pulsed. Instead, it was replaced by a blazing white flame. All of this was because of the deal he made with those unnamed beings when he was alive. They promised him the power of immortality, and he did enjoy this power after death, but in a different way. He became an undead. Only after becoming an undead could he understand how painful it was to be immortal. His soul fire was constantly burning his memories of the past. Pain, regret, anger, sorrow, and all sorts of negative emotions lingered in his heart, tormenting him day and night. Day after day, human emotions were gradually worn away. Only cold hatred for the past was left in their minds. Although he had become an undead, it wasn't as if he had gained nothing. Those unknown existences had indeed fulfilled their promise and given him power. Summoning the winter wolves in the forest was just one of them. This was a power that was far beyond the mortal world. It was completely different from the shallow power that humans had built on authority. It was a real power that could be controlled. More and more winter wolves appeared in the forest like ghosts. The wolves split into small groups and ran in all directions. Joachim listened attentively, and soon there was a long howl in the distance. He sneered. His pets had found the other party's trace. In the open space in the forest, several winter wolves circled around the bodies of their companions. They raised their heads as if they were smelling the blood in the air. Then the leading wolf let out a long howl and turned to chase in one direction. Such a scene was playing out everywhere. The wolves soon found more traces. The bodies were buried under the snow, in the thorny bushes, and some were even hidden on the trunks. Along the way to the north, there were more and more traces of such battles. As if sketching out such a scene, the crew's knight fought and retreated, but they could never get rid of the wolves' pursuit. Marquis Joachim followed behind his pack of wolves and examined each corpse one by one. The sword wounds on the corpses confirmed his conjecture. At first, the Kurlutzians still had time to dispose of the corpses or bury them under the snow, but later they had to leave the battlefield hastily and leave the bodies of the winter wolves in the forest. Moving forward, the young men simply fled the battlefield. Most of the bodies of the winter wolves stayed in the position where they were killed. This meant that the crew's people had no time to dispose of the bodies. They were fleeing in panic. On the other hand, it also meant that the wolves were getting closer and closer to them. Joachim followed unhurriedly. He sometimes had time to look up at the bright glacier in the north. If the other party knew the real name of the glacier, they would regret their choice. It was not a natural glacier, but the outer wall of the holy cathedral of the hibernator buried by the glacier. To get around the wall, they would have to go around the entire central area of Milo's breath. About a quarter of an hour later, the wolves stopped in front as if they had found something. Joachim separated the pack and walked to where they stopped. After he saw what his pets had found, he could not help but smile like a winner. It was footprints. A long series of footprints was so eye-catching in the snow. The footprints left by the crew's people went all the way into the Elson black pine forest in front of them in a panic. They don't even have time to clean up the footprints. It seems that they have noticed me. Joachim thought for a moment and snapped his fingers. He let the wolves spread out and like a large net, they filtered through the entire forest in front of them. Freya and the others struggled through the black pine forest, and the steep ice wall was already in front of them. The blue stag was still leading the way. It moved vigorously along the broken ice zone at the edge of the glacier, jumping from one sloping ice surface to another, never slipping or losing its balance. It was as steady as walking on flat ground. But this road was a bit difficult for the young people of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment. Even though almost every one of them was a master in the gold realm, and there was no lack of gold-level strength like Brund, there were still people who slipped from time to time. Due to Freya's own meager strength, Maynard and little Pero took special care of her, but even so, she still fell several times. The first time she fell, she hurt her arm, and the second time she knocked her forehead, so that it still looked red as if she was about to cry at any time, which made her very embarrassed. Because of this, the speed of the team's progress became slower and slower, and everyone seemed a little silent. Not only did this steep glacial cliff seem to have no end, but also because the forest was getting quieter, which meant that the white demons had begun to pass through the black pine forest behind them. Crack! Brund casually threw the frozen stone-like dry food into the snow, splashing a cloud of snowflakes. He saw the lump of food roll down the steep terrain, and finally fell into an ice crevice and disappeared. If they fell here, everyone might face the same danger. Those ice crevices were connected to the bottomless glaciers, and if they accidentally lost their footing, there was no hope of climbing up by themselves. Not to mention a place like Milo's Breath, even in the great glacier east of Fanzin, there were countless adventurers who disappeared under the glacier every year. He felt cold and hungry, and his eyelids were as heavy as lead, but unfortunately, they did not have time to stop for a little rest, let alone make a fire. How long is this deer going to take us along this glacier? If we go on like this, we'll be caught by the winter wolves behind us. Aaliyah could not help but complain again. It took us a lot of effort to drive them away. No one will think you're mute if you shut up. Brund replied snappily. He didn't know where this guy found so much nonsense. The wolves will also slow down when they cross the glacier. Only that guy can walk leisurely in this kind of terrain. As he said this, he stared at the blue shadow in front of him. But it was at this moment that someone in the team suddenly let out a low cry. Look over there. Aaliyah was about to retort, but when he heard this low cry, he could not help but turn his head. Everyone, including him, saw a few white shadows appear at the edge of the black forest in the distance. They were obviously wolves, and they had apparently discovered the traces of the crew's people trekking on the edge of the cliff. They glanced over from afar, then turned around and went back into the forest. Oh hell, what do you have to say now? Aaliyah looked back at Brund with a gloating expression. What's there to be happy about for you? Although he said so sarcastically, Brund still smacked his lips and muttered to himself, how could it be so fast? Haha, Aaliyah laughed as if he was not afraid of death. To be able to see you suffer, I have no regrets even if I die. If you want to die, you can jump from here, Aaliyah. Little Pero listened to this guy's words getting more and more outrageous and finally said coldly, no one will hold you back. Strangely enough, as soon as the short crew's young man from Vincennes opened his mouth, Aaliyah immediately shut up. He laughed awkwardly. I'm just saying. Besides, I really can't walk anymore. If the commander orders me to stop and cover the rear, I definitely won't refuse. I'll have a good fight with those beasts. There's no need. Freya did not know whether to laugh or cry. She really admired little Pero for being able to discipline such a guy into obedience. When she was the captain of the militia, there were also some slippery bastards in the team, but compared to Aaliyah they paled in comparison. The crew's knight in front of her really subverted her impression of the crew's people. It stopped. While everyone was arguing, Lolo was the only one who was still staring ahead. At this time he suddenly saw the beautiful blue creature stop near an ice wall in front of him. It looked at the human side as if to tell them that they had arrived at their destination. What happened next caught everyone's attention. Let's go and have a look. Little Pero spoke first. So Aaliyah and Brund also stopped arguing and the team moved on. About a quarter of an hour later they arrived at the place. But the next moment, everyone was stunned. When they got closer they found that the glacier had caved in here, forming a narrow canyon. The misty canyon, like a crack split by lightning, appeared in front of the people of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment. P.S. From today onwards, it is officially confirmed that the normal update has been resumed. I probably found the problem, feel around. In addition, continue to recommend Blackie's new book, Disaster Descends. This book is well written and is currently rushing to the signing list. If you have the ability to support it, help him get recommendation tickets and clicks. Chapter 797. The mist-filled canyon, like a crack split by lightning, appeared in front of the crowd of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment. This crack divided the entire glacier, making the mortals look incomparably small in front of this masterpiece of nature. When Freya looked up at the fragmented section of the glacier, she felt as small as the dust at the feet of a giant. The long and narrow crack stretched for several miles, forming a winding path between the intersecting and slanting ice. On the cliffs on both sides, layers of ice, icicles formed, making the entire canyon look as intricate as a maze. This is spectacular. Brund muttered to himself, and behind him, the young knight from Cruz also looked at the scene with amazement. Where's the stag? Faced with such a scene, Aaliyah had to admit that they had been following the stag for some time, but even so, it could not change his stubbornness. It went in. The mountain knight Rollo replied affirmatively. But I don't see its shadow now. Does it want us to go in? That's not very good. There are traps under these ice walls, reminding me of the dangerous wilderness valleys in the Sukalas Valley when we were training. As the master, even if it doesn't stay to lead the way for us, it should at least say, please. Besides, God knows how long this canyon is. What if it's a dead end inside? Aaliyah asked rhetorically. Rollo glanced at him and was too lazy to argue with this guy. In the end, it was little Pero who came out to calm the situation. Well, Aaliyah is right. Although the Holy Spirit guided us here, we still don't know what's ahead. I suggest that we split up a scout team from the team, just like we did when we were training in the winding valleys of Sukalas. Brund frowned, but we were doing survival training at that time, and now we have a pack of winter wolves trailing behind us. Wouldn't it be too slow if we split up a scout team and groped our way forward? We can only make this choice. The terrain in the canyon is intricate like a maze, and it won't be easier for those winter wolves to track our tracks inside than outside. Little Pero shrunk under his bearskin coat and shook his head slowly. Let's see what the commander has to say. Everyone turned to look at Freya, only to find that the Erwin girl was staring at the 10,000-year-old glacier in a daze. Her gaze had long drifted off somewhere. She stood there, as if listening and looking, as if something in the ice was talking to her, and it was not until little Pero called her 2 or 3 times that she came to her senses. Oh, what's wrong? Freya was slightly startled and looked at the others. What happened just now? The wolves have caught up? No, I didn't. Brund shook his head. But you, Sir Commander, what happened? Did you notice anything? Freya looked suspiciously at the blue steel-like glacier. She had indeed discovered something, but that wasn't the main reason for her absent-mindedness. She felt like something had happened, but she couldn't remember what it was. She thought for a moment and slowly shook her head. Regarding everyone's opinions, I do have an idea. I just don't know what Mr. Little Pero and Senior Maynold suggest. Maynold looked at her and Little Pero replied directly, Just say it, ma'am. I want to ambush Marquis Yoakum. What? Before Little Pero could speak, Brund blurted out in surprise because in his opinion, the Lady Commander's performance had been nothing more than mediocre. Although she had some convincing qualities when it came to brains, not to mention Little Pero, who was recognized as the brains of the knights, she was even slightly inferior to himself. In fact, her previous performance had also illustrated this point. Her command of several battles was like the most standard textbook. That is, you could neither find any highlights nor faults. He could not imagine why she would suddenly come up with such a risky and radical idea. It was simply not like 2 things done by one person. Little Pero was also silent for a moment. This time, it was Maynold who spoke after a moment of consideration. The woman who graduated from Erwin's Royal Knight Academy with the best grades and quickly became an official knight and was promoted to Captain of Knights, asked in her usual cold tone, Why do you think so? Actually, I've always had this idea, Senior Maynold. Freya's tone softened a little in the face of this stern senior, as if the majesty she had accumulated with great difficulty had turned back into the little girl from the countryside of Bucci in an instant. She said weakly, It's just that I haven't found a good opportunity before. The terrain here is very much to my liking. Erwin's infantry tactical drill said, Don't worry about the drill, tell me what you think. Maynold sighed and interrupted her a little impatiently. Looking at the conversation between the two, the young people from Cruz could not help but laugh. They really could not imagine that such a weak commander could lead them to this place. Even in the Cruz Empire, these guys were labeled as unruly. Other than being obedient under Veronica's command, most of the superiors who had been in charge of them would probably put them on the list of headache-inducing existences, which they were proud of. But it had to be said that sometimes, people's encounters were very strange. Probably feeling that some of the Cruz Knights' shoulders were shaking, Freya blushed, but she still answered seriously, Yes, Senior. After all, the winter wolves are monsters. If we find a way to kill the person who commands them, then they can hardly pose a threat to us anymore. We can't always be on the run in this world of ice and snow. How can you say that we're on the run? We're carrying out the established tactics. Aaliyah hurriedly corrected her, but because his movement was too big, it affected his wound, causing him to grimace in pain. The Folded Sword Knight Regiment will never run away from the enemy, Sir Commander, you have to remember this. You shut up, the Folded Sword Knight Regiment does not defeat the enemy by bragging. Brund glanced at the guy, then turned back and asked, But the question is whether we can kill him, Sir Commander, this is risky. That guy obviously won't appear at the front of the wolf pack. If we can't succeed in one blow, we may be surrounded by the wolf pack. What's more? He hesitated, what if the silver monster is with him? I say, boy, how can you achieve great things by being overly cautious? Hearing Brund's objection, Aaliyah immediately sang the opposite tune. Things on the battlefield are all about luck. If you can predict the enemy 100%, then what's the point of fighting a war? Why don't you just ask him to send a messenger to surrender? Haha, that guy might really send a wolf to surrender to you. Brund, do you understand the wolf language? The guy asked gloatingly. It doesn't matter if I understand wolf language or not. What matters is that you just opposed it and now you support it. Aaliyah, can you Aenir people not be so two-faced? Brund was finally angered by this guy's provocation and could not help but sneer coldly. Aaliyah, however, did not care and replied indifferently, "That was just now, and now is now. Just now you supported it, so naturally I had to oppose it. Now that you're against it, I'm going to support it. What, do you have any dissatisfaction?" "I don't have time to be dissatisfied with a guy like you." Brund was so angry that he wanted to say something else, but was interrupted by little Pero. The short cruise knight put his hands in the sleeves of his bearskin coat, and at first it was as if he did not hear the argument between Brund and Aaliyah. It was not until now that he spoke. "Everything else is fine, but have you thought about what to do with the silver monster?" This problem was also a problem that plagued the entire Folded Sword Knight order. If it was just the Winter Wolf and Marquis Yoakum, they would have turned around and fought their way out. But the problem was that the elusive silver monster was too terrifying, and in the battle the night before, it left a deep impression on everyone. Even Freya, who proposed it, could not help but fall silent when she heard this question. Was the silver monster there or not, and if it was, what should be done with it? Lucky guy. Yoakum could not help but sigh as he stood at the crack of the glacier, looking up to admire the majestic natural beauty. He unconsciously turned the emerald on the ringed snake ring, just like when he was still in his castle. He would do some subconscious little movements when he was thinking, as if it would help him calm down. It was just that the cold wind here could not be connected to the pleasant climate of his territory near the Grey Mountain, and the owner of the ring no longer needed such little movements to keep calm. The undead's mind was as cold as ice, and this was just a habitual action. Before the wolves discovered the rift, he couldn't believe that this group of Kurlutzians could find such an exit so coincidentally. Who would have thought that this group of Kurlutzian knights could find the only rift outside the holy cathedral of the Hibernator by accident? White Gorge, this should be the name of this place. Before the cruise people arrived here, he and Erek had spent several days looking for this crack, but in the end they found nothing and had to go back through the main gate guarded by the Frost Dragon. Who would have thought that he would actually find this place in the midst of this chase? Although he was a little upset that the cruise people had escaped again, he was also a little surprised to find this shortcut, and even felt that it was an unexpected gain. At this time, several wolves emerged from under the glacier. They howled a few times at Marquis Yoakum, who quickly understood the meaning of his pets. The cruise people really entered the canyon. They are really bold, Yoakum curled his lips, but forget it, it doesn't matter. They can walk for a while but not forever. They will soon understand that only you are the masters of the glacier. I'd like to see how far those lucky guys can run. 2 winter wolves came to his side, and Yoakum stroked their silver mane with his cold and dry palms and sneered, "Let's go, this hunt is far from over." The winter wolf seemed to understand his words and lowered its head and whimpered a few times. Yoakum heard the whimpers of his pets and frowned. "Don't worry about that guy, he is a lunatic, a psychopath. They are just the servants of the Twilight Dragon, and they are self-righteous. Don't think that others don't know that they have been defeated once in ancient times. If their race is really as powerful as they boast, how could they be defeated by the Azure Knight? In the end they still have to rely on our strength. All things become one. How could those guys who only know how to kill and only know how to use brute force understand that they are nothing more than fighting creatures created by chaos?" He patted his pet's forehead. "Of course I understand. That little girl may be a little strange. I have heard rumors about her. I suspect that she is the daughter of the Earth Knight, Everton. Oh, the royal faction claims that the traitor is dead, thinking that we don't know about their clumsy lies. But it doesn't matter, our first goal is still to kill those cruise knight. Letting them stay with Veronica is a hidden danger, which is something that the old guy Erek doesn't want to see. As for that little girl, she can't escape anyway. Go, my pet, chase them until they have no way to escape," Yoakum said loudly. He looked up, but did not realize that behind the layers of ice walls above his head, in the crevices of the glacier, sharp arrows were placed on longbows, moving in the direction he was moving. At this moment even Aaliyah, who had been chattering incessantly, held his breath, and all the Folded Sword Knights hiding on the ice wall looked nervously at the winter wolves around Yoakum that were like a rolling torrent. The wolves were crossing the marquee and entering the canyon. Fortunately we stayed. Brund was an orthodox knight. Although he had learned archery, he was not good at it. So at this moment he stood behind everyone with a long sword in his hand, and when he saw such a scene, he could not help but wipe his cold sweat. If we continue to run, we will be surrounded sooner or later. It was not until this moment that he really looked at Freya with some admiration. But at this moment, the girl from the countryside of Bucci frowned deeper than everyone else. She did not expect that the number of winter wolves would be so large. 1. The Sukras Valley, located in the north of Cruz, was the natural habitat of the petrifying lizards. It was the existence of the Cruz Empire as a military-restricted area all year round, but contrary to other people's speculation of a training ground, this place was actually a high-quality crystal mine. But since the Empire discovered this place in the Year of Thunder, there had been no way to defeat the petrifying lizards and steadily mine high-quality magic crystals from here. Chapter 798. Freya bit her lip as she watched the wolves gather in the canyon and then suddenly disperse, revealing something in the middle. It was a few wolf corpses stacked on top of each other, and traces of a fierce battle were scattered around the snow. This was arranged in advance to ensure that Joachim could enter their optimal shooting range. After discovering these corpses, Joachim walked over slowly. 4 giant wolves the size of heavy warhorses surrounded him. They were the ghosts of the winter that often appeared in folk tales, the children of Ekis, the pale suns, who were far more terrifying than the winter wolves in this forest. "Are you sure?" Brund asked with a sigh of relief when he saw Joachim squatting down beside the wolf corpses and began to examine them. "We can try," Lolo replied. After a simple question and answer, the folded sword knight made the final adjustments. They took a deep breath, held their breath, kept their hands holding the bow steady, and then slowly pushed the bow to the string. The bow creaked. Most of the bows suitable for the strength of the gold rank were magic bows. Only composite bows treated with the laws of strengthening and toughening could withstand 100 times the strength of an ordinary person. But even so, every time the bow was drawn, it was still equivalent to the loss of the bow's lifespan. This loss was irreversible. In Erewhon, a magic bow could even be bought for 17,000 tor per bow. Even if it was the work of the masters in the workshops directly under the royal family, most of these bows would not be drawn more than 100 times. Every time the bow was drawn, it was almost equivalent to squandering the weight of the bow. There was no wind in the canyon, and Joachim was still unaware, but it was as if there was a natural sensitivity to danger that made him look up. His subtle movements seemed to touch the tense nerves of the crew's people. Little Pero looked at Freya and the latter nodded gently. Freya exhaled softly as if to calm herself down. "Shoot." Almost at the same time, Maynard gave the order to attack in a cold voice. The archers released their bowstrings one after another. The power attached to the arrows was so great that when they left the bowstrings, they let out a deafening hum. Wherever the arrows passed, the air surged. From afar it looked like the space was shaking. The first arrow flew over the flank of the winter wolves, and the whirlwind it created blew the wolves off their feet. Under such an attack, Joachim had no time to react. He had just turned his head, and the arrow was already in front of him. Everyone could see his panicked and incredulous face. The giant wolf beside him saved his life. The huge pale sun leaped up and blocked the path of the arrow. Then the arrow hit one side of its back. The huge impact directly penetrated the pale sun into the snow, splashing snow everywhere. The rain of arrows fell. The 4 pale suns around Joachim were instantly shot like hedgehogs, but at least they had bought time for the Marquis, allowing him to finally realize what had happened. He never dreamed that those dazed crew's knight would dare to take the initiative to attack him. And by the time he realized this, everything had become irreparable. Joachim immediately got down and hid among the winter wolves. He tried to retreat to the other side of the canyon to find a place to hide. But unfortunately, the ambush point that little Pero and Maynard chose for him was surrounded by flat ground. The small group of winter wolves that had previously surrounded him quickly fell down one by one, while more winter wolves were still far away on the flanks or had already chased into the canyon. Joachim began to regret it. He should not have been so rash, but it was too late to say anything now. But when the wolves gradually became sparse, an arrow hit him. He screamed and fell into the snow. The arrow pierced his left calf and nailed him to the ground. If he was still alive, he would be sweating in pain at this moment, but one of the benefits of the undead was that they lost their sense of pain. Joachim hurriedly gritted his teeth and turned back, pulling out the sword at his waist, trying to cut off the long feather arrow that nailed him to the ground. At the same time, the wolves in the canyon finally discovered the attackers. The wolves in the pack let out howls one after another, and the closer wolves had begun to turn around and pounce on the crew's knight above the cliff. The closer winter wolves, on the other hand, rushed to Marquis Joachim, trying to protect their master. Brund, Aliyah, lead the team to stop them. Freya stared at the winter wolves all over the mountains and plains, rushing towards their position like a reverse avalanche. This scene was so similar to what she had seen in Ampere Seal, as if it had happened yesterday. The Valkyrie clenched the sword in her hand. It was impossible to say that she was not nervous. After all, she was just a knight captain at that time. At this moment, her every order determined whether everyone present would be buried here or escape alive. She clenched her hands so hard that her knuckles turned white because of the loss of blood, but she did not notice it herself. Thousands of winter wolves were less than 100 feet away from them, and with the speed of the winter wolves, it would only take 2 breaths to rush in front of them. The snowy wolf pack, in which every beast bared its fangs that gleamed with a cold light, were clearly visible. Lolo, prepare for the second round of shooting. Freya took a deep breath and tried to keep her voice as calm as possible as she ordered. Lolo licked his lips. Even for the people of Cruz, such a big scene was not often seen, not to mention that they were just some newbies. The battle in front of them even surpassed the battle that broke out last night, and when the wolves charged in the open terrain outside the forest, the momentum was by no means the same. Including him, everyone's palms were oozing with a thin layer of oily sweat. However, their daily training worked, and the young knights of Cruz raised their longbows in unison. Just as they drew their bows, the knight in the back row had already picked up his shield and stepped out with his longsword in hand. They were 20 steps away from the front line and formed a thin blocking formation, led by Brund and Elia. The wolves were less than 50 feet away. The knights put down their long shields and inserted the pointed end of the shield into the snow. The center of gravity of their bodies was also lowered, ready to receive the impact. Lolo narrowed his eyes and raised the longbow in his hand a little higher. His line of sight was always raised, over a line of rushing wolves, and the arrow cluster that gleamed with a cold light was still aimed at the bottom of the canyon. Release. Maynard waited until all the archers had adjusted and immediately issued an order. At the same time, Joachim finally turned around and cut off the arrow stuck in his left leg with a sword. Although the undead did not feel pain, it did not mean that he would not be troubled by pain. The loss of soul power almost made him suck in a breath of cold air. After doing this, he did not rush to escape. Instead, he threw down the long sword in his hand somewhat dispiritedly, turned over with difficulty and then looked at the sky. Joachim's pale eyes flashed with a gray light. The expression inside was both madness and despair. In his field of vision above the sky, arrows fell like rain. He opened his mouth, revealing his white teeth as if he was making a final cry, but there was no sound. Almost in an instant, more than 20 arrows nailed him to the ground together with the winter wolf that had just arrived. Joachim raised his head, persisted for the last moment, and then lay down dejectedly. When the winter wolf collided with the knight's shield, there was a dull thud. The impact of these beasts was so great that if it were an ordinary human soldier, he would have been blown away at this moment. When the Duke of Long Blade fought against the large-scale movements of the tundra wolves on the plateau, he often needed to arrange his soldiers in a large square of 7 rows, far beyond the extent of fighting against heavy cavalry. But the winter wolves were also facing extraordinary opponents. The dozens of Cruz Knight in the front row were all gold rankers. In front of them, the winter wolves were not much different from ordinary wolves. The knight used their shields to lift the wolves that crashed into them, or nailed them to the snow with their swords, and then took a step back, waiting for the second attack. Unlike Elia, who was slashing and killing, Brund was carefully calculating the distance they would retreat. According to his calculations, they would have to hold on for at least 5 rounds of attacks. Before that, they had to buy enough time, the more the better. But after the third impact, the Cruz Knights suddenly felt that their vision was empty, and the repulsed winter wolves did not rush up again. What's going on? Everyone subconsciously looked down at the canyon below. In the misty fog, countless white beasts were fleeing in all directions. It was not until this moment that the archers in the back cheered. Little Pero, Maynard, and Freya all looked nervously at the place where Joachim had fallen, because no one could say for sure whether the winter wolves would leave after Joachim's death. The only thing they could count on was that at least after losing their commander, the winter wolves would only have the instincts of wild beasts. At least they would not act in an orderly manner like an army. It was undoubtedly a fantasy to break out of the encirclement of an army, but if the opponent was just a group of beasts acting on instinct, then it might not be so. But the reality was far better than they imagined. At the moment when Joachim fell, although there were still a small number of winter wolves attacking them, but further away, the large-scale wolves had begun to show signs of hesitation and scattering. The Cruz Knight with longbows were the first to notice this sign and could not help but cheer in unison. Then little Pero could not help but breathe a sigh of relief. He turned back and congratulated Freya, half relaxed and half glad. "It seems that we made the right bet, Commander." Freya just nodded slightly. Joachim was dead and everyone saw it with their own eyes. The wolves were also collapsing, and although there were still a small number of them who were still entangled with them, their numbers were no threat to them at all. But even so, she was still a little worried. There was only one problem. The premise of their ambush was if the silver monster was not with Yoakum. What if the monster was lurking around? No one could say for sure. Maynard was keenly aware of her junior's worries. She looked back at the latter and asked, "What's wrong?" "I'm a little worried," Freya replied. "Senior Maynard, I think we'd better get out of here as soon as possible." "Are you worried about the monster?" Little Pero also thought of this question. "But if it's here, it wouldn't let Yoakum be ambushed by us, would it?" "I don't know," Freya shook her head gently, "but I have a hunch that something is wrong." "You're too nervous, Commander." Little Pero shook his head. He had received professional military training. For soldiers, hunches were probably the most unbelievable thing. But Maynard's judgment was the opposite of his. The female knight frowned and asked, "A hunch? Did you miss something?" Freya was slightly startled. She looked at her senior with some surprise. She did not expect the other party to be so clear about what she was thinking. It was this feeling that she always felt that she had missed something. Maynard stared at her and did not speak. But if Brando was here, he would be doubly vigilant. The Valkyrie's hunch was a very famous rumor in his world. Chapter 799. A small team of cruise knights climbed down the steep glacial cliff and slowly approached Yoakum's body. The body was nailed to the ground in a strange posture by the huge impact of the arrow. The undead had long since died, its eye sockets were dark and its soul flame had been extinguished. The leading knight could not help but let out a long sigh of relief. His warm breath weaved into a thin white mist in the cold canyon and quickly blended into the surrounding icy mist. The wolves had long retreated, and there were still some wolf corpses left around, stained with blood and broken arrows all over the ground. The canyon was eerily quiet. He should have reported immediately after confirming Yoakum's death, but this strange silence made him look around again. In a trance, he seemed to see something standing in the depths of the canyon. A beast the size of a pony stood behind the mist, its hair moving without wind. He jumped in fright and looked over, only to find that there was nothing there. The beast he thought was just the mist floating in the deep canyon, but even so, the knight could not help but break out in a cold sweat. After the short ambush, the canyon fell into this strange atmosphere. The current situation seemed to be more terrible than when they were still being chased by the wolves. The captain of the knight took a deep breath and seemed to be ready to stabilize his emotions. He was a member of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment, one of the best of the younger generation of crews. It would be too embarrassing to be frightened by a quiet canyon. But just as he was about to let out a breath, he realized that something seemed to be wrong around him. "Captain?" A stammering voice sounded behind him. It was the voice of his subordinate. The knight suddenly looked up, and unknowingly, a pair of cold yellow eyes had appeared in front of him. Wool dash. Little Pero, Brund, and Maynard, everyone was silently waiting for the reassuring news from below, but what they waited for was a scream of panic. Clack! With a soft sound, a silver-maned monster jumped down from somewhere and landed in front of everyone. It was the pale sun. The anxiety and uneasiness in Freya's heart seemed to have become reality in an instant. Everyone knew that Yoakum was driving the winter wolf forward, and it was the silver monster who was controlling the pale sun. 2, 3, one after another, the monsters fell from above and landed around the Kurlutzian knights. They did not make any threatening growls, nor did they advance prematurely. They just surrounded them, raised their heads and stared at the humans with cold eyes. Those eyes were full of wisdom that should not belong to a beast, but it was precisely because of this that they felt a chill from the bottom of their hearts. Freya was the first to react. She raised her head, her light brown pupils shrinking slightly against the morning sun. Sure enough, she saw a few white figures appearing at the top of the glacier that was reflecting the light. Unknowingly, these pale suns had already run above them. In other words, when they were still full of confidence in ambushing Yoakum, these monsters had already begun their encirclement. How could this be? Since the second half of last night, these pale suns and the silver monster had not appeared again. Everyone believed that they had separated from Yoakum, but now it seemed that they had arrived here first. The girl from Bucci felt a chill in her heart. Could it be that the Folded Sword Knight Regiment lied to her? But what good would it do them? She shook her head hard to throw this ridiculous idea out of her mind. The crew's people were in the same boat as her at the moment, so it was unlikely that they would lie about this issue. That is to say, their scouts really did not see the pale sun behind the winter wolf. She couldn't help but look at Brund. Brund's face was also green and white. Apparently he also thought of this. After Anika's death, he was the captain of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment scout team, and now it was obvious that there was a mistake in his work. Black Blade. Brund growled angrily. Captain, it's not my fault. I swear in the name of the Flame King that I never saw a pale sun among the winter wolves, except for the 4 around Yoakum. The knight who was named explained in a low voice with an aggrieved look on his face. It's not his fault. Freya saw the reaction of the two and breathed a sigh of relief. She quickly stopped the quarrel in a low voice. These monsters have already circled above us, which means that they should have at least arrived before Yoakum. But it doesn't make sense. In that case, why would they just watch Yoakum die? I don't know. Maybe the silver monster has a conflict with Yoakum. Aaliyah pressed his wound and stared at the monsters surrounding them. He shrugged. This was one of the possibilities, but Freya instinctively felt that this was not the truth of the matter. Monsters, there are so many of them. Shouts came from far below the canyon. Little Pero, Brund, Commander, be careful, they're coming for you. Then came the sound of fierce fighting, the sounds of people and beasts fighting intertwined. All the Kurlutzians in the front row subconsciously raised the swords in their hands. The long swords shone brightly in the cold air, confronting the white teeth of the giant demonic wolf not far away. The next moment, there was a sudden scream from the crowd. Everyone turned their heads, only to see that a pale sun had come among them at some point, biting off the arm of a knight with a folded sword. The knight clutched the bloody broken arm and stabbed the pale sun in the left eye with a backhand. The latter also let out a whine and hurriedly retreated. The knight next to him stepped forward to protect his companion. Be careful, they have invisibility spells. The knight with the broken arm gritted his teeth and shouted. Everyone's expression changed. Pay attention to your surroundings. Freya shouted. She remembered the tactics of the invisible ghosts she had seen in the forest and instinctively felt that the fighting style of these invisible monsters might be the same. Sure enough, a giant beast suddenly appeared on her left. It was like a flowing transparent liquid in the air, opening its huge mouth and biting at her. But before it could bite, a blue light appeared on Freya's armor, blocking the fangs out of the light wall. Half-body armor of the Wind Empress. Brund let out a low cry. At this time, Maynard had already taken a step forward and stabbed her sword into the throat of the stunned beast. Ever since she met the crystal stag with Brando that night, with the help of the raw stone of strength, her progress had also improved by leaps and bounds. The golden flames burned fiercely in her body, and the luster of elemental strength was about to be born. And this sword was worthy of the female knight's rapid progress during this period of time. The tip of the sword flashed with a faint black light that was difficult for outsiders to detect. It broke through the dark magic protection around the pale sun's body and pierced the monster's throat. The giant wolf didn't seem to think that it would die so easily. It struggled for a moment and then fell down with a crash. This is the armor he gave you, Maynard said as she pulled the long sword out of the giant wolf's mouth and wiped it on the silver mane. Yes. Although the half-body armor of the Wind Empress is a standard armor, it has been passed down for generations and is still priceless. It seems that he cares a lot about you. Maynard answered pointedly. She glanced at Freya, and the meaningful look in her eyes made the latter's heart pound. Freya sighed softly. If it wasn't for the half-body armor of the Wind Empress, the giant wolf's bite would have bitten her entire right shoulder, shoulder blade, and chest. She could almost imagine the coldness of the sharp teeth piercing through her body. She would have died without a doubt. Brando had saved her again. She couldn't even count how many times she had owed him. This was the first time she had owed him a favor. She gripped the sword in her hand and came back to her senses. She turned her head away, trying her best to avoid looking at her senior's strange gaze. She felt that there seemed to be some other meaning behind it, and she didn't know how to answer. At this time, the knight and the Pale Suns were already fighting. The Pale Sun's surprise attack caused Cruz's people to suffer heavy losses, but it had to be said that it was thanks to Freya's previous reminder. Otherwise, the current situation would not be as simple as just heavy losses. However, even so, the folded sword knights were still scattered by the sudden appearance of the monsters. The pale suns that appeared from the invisibility spell seemed to be pouring out from all directions. These winter nightmares were not as weak and easily bullied as their close relatives. As dusk species, even after 1,000 years of decline, they still retained at least the strength of a peak silver to early gold rank. The Cruz Knight immediately fell into a bitter battle against these troublesome opponents. Or rather, it was somewhat inappropriate to say that it was a bitter battle, because from the beginning, the young folded sword knights were retreating in defeat and gradually lost their organization and connection. Freya was separated from Maynard, and soon only Aaliyah and Brund were left by her side. Even little Pero was nowhere to be seen. "Commander, which direction should we break through?" Aaliyah asked with narrowed eyes. Freya shook her head. The only choice they had at present was to move closer to the center of the canyon and see if they could gather others there. I still haven't figured out where these damn things came from. Brund couldn't help but curse. Black Blade can't be wrong, and if the silver monster was close to us, how could it just watch Yokum die? Even if they have a conflict, it would be easy for it to kill us. Why would it play this game of hide-and-seek with us? I heard that cats have a habit of teasing mice. Aaliyah replied. It's not a cat and we're not mice. Brund retorted angrily. Freya listened to the conversation between the two and frowned. She was thinking the same thing. She raised her head and carefully observed the smooth fracture at the top of the glacier. From time to time, pale suns jumped down from it and landed in the middle of the crowd. Seeing this scene, she suddenly shuddered and thought of something. Brund, do you remember the direction where those giant wolves came from? Commander, they came from above the glacier, it's obvious. No, I mean last night. Brund's expression changed. In the forest, they came from the forest. They can't inhabit the forest. The forest is the territory of the winter wolves, and the two kinds of wolves can't live together. If there's such a glacier behind the forest... Wait, Commander, you mean? Brund also reacted at once. I remember Brando often told some legends about the deadly frost forest. In the center of the forest is a huge maze, which is the holy temple of the hibernator of Milos, the god of the frost giants. I suddenly remembered that this is not a glacier but the outer wall of the holy temple of the hibernator. These monsters came from inside the temple. What? Aaliyah finally heard the conversation between the two. You mean these monsters live here? This is their lair? This news that others couldn't help but frown when they heard it, sounded very happy to him. Commander, you mean that the monsters we see in front of us didn't arrive here first, but they are wild, so they have nothing to do with the silver monster. It sounded as if he was relieved that he didn't have to deal with the silver monster. But unfortunately, Freya obviously didn't think so. The premonition in her heart gradually became reality, and at this moment, the chaotic clues in her mind became 1,000 times clearer. She raised her head and looked at the three. I want to know if these monsters came from here, then where did the silver monster come from? Brund and Aaliyah's expressions suddenly changed, and even Maynard raised her eyebrows. And it was at this moment that a sharp laughter interrupted Freya's words. As expected of the descendant of the goddess of war, so sharp. Freya suddenly widened her eyes and shouted, Be careful, Brund, behind you. Chapter 800. Freya saw Brund turn his head subconsciously, but his whole body suddenly seemed to be pushed from behind. His chest thrust forward and a blood-stained silver awl pierced out from under his breastplate. Brund groaned, his eyes suddenly widened as if he had been hit hard. He opened his mouth to say something to her, but as soon as he opened his mouth, the blood foam that flowed backward from the pierced lung immediately gushed out from the corner of his mouth. Don't. Although it was not the first time she had witnessed life and death on the battlefield, this time was different. This time she was the commander and everyone's life and death were in her hands. The trust that Brund and the others had in her, an unremarkable commander, was only exchanged for such a cold death. Everything was just because of her decision. This was wrong. She clearly saw the silver monster converging behind Brund like Mercury, first the torso, then the head, and in the blink of an eye, it had taken shape. On the silver featureless face, a crescent-shaped mouth seemed to be silently mocking her. It seemed to be mocking her, mocking the commander's lack of strategy and weakness. She had clearly warned him, but it was still a little too late, just a little too late. The pale and calm face of the dead lice, the burning village in the mountains of Yusong, and Brund, whose face was now covered in blood and staring at her with wide eyes, all the pictures seemed to overlap in front of her. Monster. Monster. Freya felt as if the blood all over her body had solidified. She subconsciously and stiffly pulled out her sword. Her duty as commander had long been abandoned. She was like a warrior who felt the burning pain in her face and wanted to put her life on the line to avenge her companions to make up for her shame. But it was at this moment that a roar came first, suppressing her voice. Monster. She heard Aaliyah, the rough guy who had always seemed to have a problem with Brund, make this sound like a roar. His eyes seemed to be bloodshot, and almost without thinking, he knocked away the giant wolf that was pouncing on him with an elbow, then turned around and slashed at the silver monster with his sword, roaring from his throat, You damned beast! This scene seemed to have frozen in front of her eyes, slowed down and stretched, causing her to wake up. Because she was still the commander, everyone could lose their minds because of anger, but only she did not have the right. Day after day, she remembered the days when she was studying in the Royal Knight Academy. She remembered the tall figure who opened the door to another world for her. She came from the countryside of Wuxia. She was a clumsy girl. When she came to a place that she had never heard of or even dared to think about, she only felt fear and uneasiness in her heart. But when everyone around her bloomed with dazzling brilliance, she had to work hard in the quiet hours of the night to memorize the knowledge that others took for granted. Because others were so outstanding, she could only follow suit and work twice as hard as others. But even so, she was still the Cinderella who carefully picked up the long skirt behind the princess. However, she still did not choose to give up, or rather she did not dare to give up. The nobles will eventually give up on Wuxia, because the weak have no right to choose. Freya, if you want to change everyone's fate, you must go to this place. It was like a bolt of lightning in the dark night, and like a voice that only belonged to her, telling her in her heart, Freya, you can't waste your efforts. You have persevered for hundreds of days and nights in the academy. You have done everything that you didn't dare to think about before. You have worked twice as hard as others, isn't it to prove everything in front of you? You can do it, you are not worse than anyone else. One day the people of Wuxia will be able to control their own fate and take back the lost land. Brando, this murmur that seemed to be in a dream turned into a serious order when it reached her mouth. Aaliyah, I order you to come back. Brun's mouth was full of blood and he looked at her in surprise. He opened his mouth, but his mouth opened and closed, and he did not have the strength to make a sound. Aaliyah's long sword had already slashed towards the monster's right arm. The sword slashed down and cut open the mercury-like arm like a hot knife cutting butter, but it did not have the slightest effect. As soon as the blade passed, the wound was restored to its original state. The silver monster turned its head, its expression unchanged, or it had no expression at all, only the big mouth that opened like a crack silently mocking. It let out a hollow sneer, waved its left hand, and a stream of silver metal swept towards the knight's neck like a long whip. But the black blade suddenly cut between the two. Dang! The long and narrow blade turned the tip of the sword, causing the stream of metal to completely collide with the ridge of the sword, scattering into countless silver particles like water droplets. Maynard put away the sword cleanly and then turned back to look at Freya with some surprise. The girl from the countryside of Wuxia's face was still flushed, and there were still remnants of self-blame and regret in her expression, but there was only determination left in her bright light brown eyes. She had seen such a look before in another dream, and occasionally when the clumsy little girl was trying to learn to keep up with everyone's pace. Quick! Retreat! Brund finally squeezed out a trace of strength to make a sound at this moment. I will never leave you, idiot Brund. Aaliyah replied angrily. Protect the commander. Brund's mouth opened and closed as if he wanted to say this sentence. Freya looked at the young knight who could barely speak and was so sad that she wanted to cry, but she knew that she could not lose her calm at all. There must be a silver lining in a desperate situation. This was a famous saying in Introduction to the Wardworth's War. At this moment the girl's mind flashed like lightning, and all the scenes that she had memorized in the past flashed in her mind and became extremely clear. That monster is coming for me. It wants to kill us. But the pale suns are far from enough. You must not panic, Freya. The silver monster pulled back its blood-stained right hand from Brund's back and glanced at Aaliyah, who was pouncing on it like a mad dog, but it did not care about this humble human. Its eyes were always on Freya, if it had eyes. Aaliyah's second sword came as scheduled, and at the same moment, Brund knelt weakly on the ground as if he had been drained of his strength after being released by the monster. All of this happened in the blink of an eye. Senior Maynard, please go and cooperate with Aaliyah. Freya suddenly whispered. Maynard paused slightly. She did not look back but still asked, Are you sure what you are doing, Freya? We still have a chance to save Brund. Are you sure of that? I'm sure. The female knight nodded slightly. You are the commander, I believe in you. With that, she pulled out her long sword and stood up to face the silver monster with Aaliyah on the left and right. Freya opened her mouth, standing in the cold wind. Her fingertips were a little white. She still did not understand why Brando and Senior Maynard would believe in her so much. There were clearly many people in the academy who were more outstanding than her. Why did they choose her, just to play an ugly duckling game? Or was it because they saw their past in her? These were not reliable. Brando might be possible, but Senior Maynard was not such a boring person. She had once inquired about her past. She was so outstanding that no one could be jealous. If the stars in the sky were twinkling, then Maynard must be the most dazzling one. Even if Freya was confident, she would not think that she had anything in common with such a person, and Brando was the same. Other than Senior Maynard, was there anyone better than him? She found it hard to believe. She could not understand a lot of things. Sometimes she always felt that the world was too complicated for her, but fortunately Freya at least understood a little. For her there was only one Butchie. It was just a moment of trance, she reacted, there was not much time left for her, she had to make a decision immediately. She looked up as if she had summoned all the courage in her body, calmly raised her voice and issued such an order. Senior Maynard, Aaliyah, you stop that monster. Then she took out the trombone from her waist, the commanding trombone of the Cruz people, the testimony of the glory of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment. Brund and Little Perro gave this trombone to her for safekeeping. It was a heavy trust in itself. Freya did not hesitate, she took a deep breath and blew hard. Woo-woo, the long sound of the horn reverberated through the valley. It was trembling and distant, as if it contained the whispers of ancient times. When the horn reverberated through the mountains, not only did the wolves in the valley hear it, the knights who were fighting alone also heard it. As if subconsciously they listened attentively. Knights of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment, don't fight alone, come close to me and meet at the bottom of the valley. If we work together, we still have a chance to win. A voice echoed between the valley. The girl's voice was steady even beyond her own imagination. Before this, she would never have believed that she could remain calm in such a situation. The young men of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment looked back while resisting the strong enemy, and sure enough, they saw the torn silver flag between the galloping wolves. The flag was still there and the folded sword was still fighting. The knight let out a roar in unison. Retreat? Don't even think about it, don't presume to command in front of me, who do you think you are? Only Aaliyah was still roaring. Brund, hang in there, I'll get you back right away. Freya pretended not to hear what he said as she stared at the monster. Aaliyah attacked the silver monster like a madman, while Maynard assisted from the side. The female knight often did not attack, but just delayed the silver monster's offensive, as if it was really as Freya ordered, covering him to save Brund. The monster seemed to feel the movement on the battlefield, it raised its head, and although there was no expression on its face, the girl from the countryside of Butchie felt the anxiety in its heart for the first time. Don't even think about catching me, monster, you've lost your chance. She stared at the other party and said word by word. With that, she held the temporary battle flag in one hand and turned to retreat to the bottom of the valley. Among the several people present, only Maynard, who had been paying attention to the movement behind her, and Brund, who was kneeling on the ground, noticed her move. A light flashed in the female knight's eyes, but Brund reacted before she did. Stop it. The young knight, who was kneeling on the ground, seemed to shudder and suddenly let out a hoarse roar. Aaliyah, or I'll break up with you. Maynard subconsciously wanted to turn around, but as soon as she turned around, a mercury-like curtain had completely separated her from Aaliyah on the other side. Don't even think about running, the trick from 1,000 years ago won't work now. A cold voice passed over her, and instantly rushed in the direction of Freya. Don't do anything stupid, Freya, do you know what you're carrying? The female knight's heart was cold, she suddenly understood Freya's true intentions, but what she did not expect was that the child had learned to lie to her. The next moment, the mercury-like curtain had knocked her and Aaliyah out. P.S. I'll continue to recommend Blackie's book, The Descent of Calamity. It's at the starting point, you can search for it. I'm also continuing to work hard. By the way, something good happened today, haha, it has something to do with you, you'll know what it is soon. Chapter 801. Sensing that the monster was catching up from behind, Freya was nervous but also a little excited. She was like a person walking on a tightrope. In a desperate situation, one mistake and she would be doomed eternally. Usually it was at this moment that she became more confident. Her mind was also clear, and she could unleash her extraordinary potential. So, this was the feeling of adventure. However, the monster was very fast. Freya only ran a few steps before she turned around and saw that the monster was already right in front of her. Its speed was beyond her imagination. She was a little anxious. She wanted to take a step forward, but she had to take into account the ambush of the surrounding pale suns. While she was distracted, a pale sun pounced on her from behind. The difference in strength between a silver tear and a gold tear made her feel as if she was hit by a dragon. She was thrown back and rolled a few times before she fell into the snow. The battle flag in her hand also flew a few meters away. Ugh, Freya groaned. Before she could care about the pain all over her body, she heard the footsteps of the monster behind her. She quickly got up and rushed over to pick up her battle flag. However, the pale sun that pounced on her did not seem to want to let her go. It circled around behind her and followed her again. That's right, Freya's light brown eyes darkened slightly. She took a deep breath and deliberately slowed down her pace. As expected, the giant wolf seized the opportunity and pounced on her with a low growl. However, this was the moment she was waiting for. She turned her body slightly to the side and passed by the pale sun. The vortex created by the giant wolf's sharp claws almost scraped Freya's cheeks. There were even a few small wounds that oozed blood. However, the girl did not care about that. The moment the giant wolf passed by her, she jumped hard and pounced on its broad back. The pale sun immediately felt that something was wrong. It roared and shook its back trying to throw Freya off. But Freya had waited so long for this opportunity, so how could she let it have its way? She held the flagpole in one hand and tightly strangled the monster's neck at the same time. Her other hand gripped the pale sun's long silver mane tightly, allowing it to shake its body restlessly. Freya stuck herself to its back without moving an inch. The pale sun was shocked and angry. It let out a low growl and ran wildly, as if it wanted to rely on the bumps to throw Freya off its back. However, its running was exactly what the girl wanted. Although the pale sun's strength was only around the level of gold tier, which was far inferior to that of the silver monster, the level of strength determined one's physical quality. However, in some aspects, it was not an absolute difference. Just like how an adult ordinary human would certainly not be able to outrun an ordinary gray wolf, or the difference between a wizard and a warrior of the same level of strength was purely a difference in strength. The pale sun was similar to the silver monster. The silver monster was good at close combat and could cast illusions and many other spells. It had excellent strength and dexterity. Obviously, it was an all-round warrior. On the other hand, the pale sun was a four-legged canine. Although it was a dusk species, it still maintained some of the basic abilities of a beast. Speed was one of them. Freya did not know so much. If Brando was here, he might be able to give her a clear and logical analysis. However, for a country girl like her who came from the countryside of Buchi and had only received a period of intensive training, she only needed to understand one thing. This giant wolf ran faster than her. That was enough. In the wind and lightning, Freya was almost unable to open her eyes. The hair in front of her forehead danced wildly in front of her eyes. Her eyes seemed to be filled with tears, and they could not be stopped by the strong wind. So, she simply closed her eyes and held tightly onto the mane of the pale sun. This ferocious monster became more and more manic and restless. When it was unrestrained, it almost left the ground with its limbs. When it was shaking violently, she almost coughed loudly every time it hit the breastplate. There were a few times when she almost lost her grip and was thrown out. Fortunately, she took the time to look back and saw that the silver monster was already far behind her. Although she was a little curious as to why that thing hated her so much, even so, it was still following her from afar. It seemed to have said something like, "Goddess of War." Freya also remembered that Brando seemed to have said the same thing to her. However, Wone did not have a goddess of war. Whether it was the people of Cruz, the people of Erwin, or even the gods worshipped by the Wind Elves, there was only the existence of the Dragon of War. But soon, she did not have time to think about these details. The pale sun had brought her across more than half of the battlefield and was about to reach the bottom of the valley. The girl and the wolf were like a gust of wind as they passed through a few positions that were fighting with other giant wolves. Freya squinted her eyes and forced herself to look forward under the strong wind. In front of her was the bottom of the glacial valley. She suddenly gritted her teeth. One of her hands tightly held onto the silver mane of the giant wolf, and the other hand finally let go of its neck. When they passed by a piece of soft snow, Freya gritted her teeth and inserted the war flag into the ground. "Knights, come to me!" Freya's shouts echoed around the mountains, and the war flag stood firmly at the bottom of the valley. However, under the encirclement of the wolves on the battlefield, it was impossible to see what was under the flag. At the same time, the moment the war flag was inserted, the pale sun had already carried the girl from the countryside of Buchi into a narrow glacier crevice. Freya subconsciously wanted to touch the horn tied to her waist. She was afraid that her shouts could not be heard by others, but it was at this moment that the pale sun suddenly jerked, and the horn flew out of her hand. Freya was almost stunned. That was the token of the folded sword knight order. Little Pero and the others repeatedly told her to take good care of it. She did not expect that she would lose it at this time. She stared dumbfoundedly as the horn flew out and hit a piece of ice and broke into several pieces. She was extremely frustrated. "You evil beast." The girl could not help but scold anxiously. But the giant wolf was now even more dissatisfied than she was. No one would be happy if they ran for several miles with a little mouse on their head without being able to shake it off. At this time, it finally felt that the woman on its back loosened her grip a little. It suddenly stopped galloping and at the same time, its whole body swung to the side. From extreme movement to extreme stillness, The huge force generated by the momentary change of state was almost completely reflected on Freya. Before she could finish her sentence, she was directly lifted off the back of the pale sun by inertia. At that moment, Freya did not foresee this change at all. When she felt herself rising into the air, her heart almost jumped out of her throat. But even under such circumstances, the girl's mind was still clear. She still did not loosen her left hand and tightly grabbed the silver mane of the pale sun. Although there was a moment when she almost felt that her hand was going to break, in the end, this action saved her life. She pulled the mane and flew in a circle in the air, and then landed heavily on the back of the pale sun. The impact of landing directly made her burst into tears. Even the pale sun couldn't help but groan in a low voice. Obviously it wasn't feeling well either. Of course, its voice was more anxious and uneasy. The little mouse on its head seemed to be glued to it and wouldn't come down no matter what. After running for a few miles, this monster was also a little out of breath, as if it had inherited the common characteristic of this kind of beast. It was full of explosive power, but it lacked the necessary endurance. It had to slow down and even had the tendency to roll twice on the ground, trying to see if it could get Freya off its back. But Freya had been tormented by it, so how could she let it slow down at this time? The monster just showed signs of rolling to one side. She was shocked, and as if she had an epiphany, she subconsciously pulled out a dagger from her boot and stabbed the pale sun's buttocks with the dagger. It was a completely subconscious action, which came from several special methods of stimulating the warhorse that she had learned in riding lessons. Although the warhorse was the closest companion of the cavalry on the battlefield, due to various needs, especially when there were no spurs, all knights had to learn some special skills. Freya could be said to have applied what she had learned flexibly. She directly used it on the pale sun she was sitting on, and it worked. The giant wolf almost let out a whine, which was full of unwillingness and anger. But under the pain, it really took a step forward, as if to escape the terrible woman on its back, and ran forward. As soon as the giant wolf began to run, Freya immediately began the process of chest to back. The little girl couldn't help but feel bitter, and didn't know if this was considered a self-inflicted evil. This run took a long time. Freya, who was on the wolf's back, only felt the scenery around her rapidly passing by faster and faster. Finally, the ice walls on both sides receded almost into one, like a light blue curtain of light. She was a little surprised. She didn't expect these terrible monsters to have such speed. No wonder they could easily track them in the forest. Most of the knights of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment were in the gold domain. It was difficult for ordinary people to keep up with such a group of people, let alone track them. Just as she was sighing, suddenly, her vision in front of her was empty. Behind the glacier crack there was an open valley. The bottom of the valley stretched on both sides of the cliff, and the rock walls were covered with thick ice and snow. And it was at this time that Freya suddenly felt the giant wolf under her become shorter, and its whole body knelt in the snow. After losing its center of gravity, it directly rolled forward and flew out. The girl knight on the back of the pale sun was naturally not spared. This time, the silver wolf's mane that had always brought her good luck could not save her. After a few rounds in the air, Freya finally screamed and flew out, crashing into the snow. Ah! The girl suddenly let out a cry of pain. After a long while, she climbed out of the snow dizzily. She lay on the ground, almost without the strength to stand. It felt as if her whole body was falling apart. Thinking back to the previous experience, she was really scared. She didn't dare to dream that she would have such an experience one day. It was really crazy. Freya didn't know how she made such a decision at that time. It was simply not like her own rationality. If this goes on, I'll become like that guy. She gritted her teeth and forced herself to sit up in the snow. First, she subconsciously glanced at the valley, and indeed, she saw that silver figure in the distance, rapidly approaching in this direction. Freya couldn't help but be slightly startled. She didn't expect that guy to still be chasing her. Just how much resentment did it have? She looked at the pale sun on the ground again. It had completely lost its breath, probably because it had been running for too long and had suddenly died. Ah, how could this be? She was shocked, probably not expecting that she would actually kill a pale sun like this. If she was still in Butchie, she would definitely become the bragging rights of those guys. But now it was nothing. She gritted her teeth and stood up. Previously, when she was still on the back of the giant wolf, she couldn't wait to kill it, but now that this temporary mount was dead, she was a little worried. Seeing that the monster was about to arrive, she couldn't possibly outrun it. Looking around, she had to think of a way as soon as possible. P.S. Here's a surprise for everyone. Guess what the surprise is? Chapter 802. Freya surveyed her surroundings. This open valley was different from the previous entrance to the canyon. At the very least, she could no longer see the towering blue glaciers, as well as the narrow openings and crevices beneath the glaciers. The terrain was no longer complicated and confusing. There were no layers of ice walls, nor were there icicles and ice ridges on both sides. All that was left was the steep cliffs on both sides and the open valley floor. The valley floor was covered with soft snow that had slid down from the cliffs. She looked around curiously as she limped towards the cliffs. Every step she took was deep and shallow. Occasionally she would pull at her wounds and gasp in pain. One of her pauldrons was missing, and her breastplate was badly damaged. She looked as pathetic as she could. After walking for a while, she raised her head and looked at the snow-covered cliffs. The canyon seemed to have no end. It extended endlessly in both directions. Freya looked behind her. The monster was getting closer and closer. She gritted her teeth, thinking about what she could use. She had left the dagger on the pale sun and she forgot to take it off when she left. But even if she took it back, it wouldn't be of much use in such a situation. The only weapon she had was the Lionheart sword that she had been carefully protecting, as well as some miscellaneous items. She opened her waist pouch. It was filled with a few days' worth of dry food, but it had long been frozen to the point that it was almost as cold as iron. Below it was a bottle of wild berry jam. This was something that the Roman had made for her. Even Brando did not have it. However, Freya had always politely declined this kind of thing. It was not a joke. The merchant lady's cooking had always been on the same level as the old witch in the fairy tales. It was not that she did not know how to make it. It was purely because she often had whimsical ideas to add things that were beyond the norm. Next was the explosive crystals that Amandina had given her. There were a total of 6 of them. Originally she and Brando had 3 each. However, Brando did not have much use for them, so he gave them all to her before they left yesterday. This way she could better deal with unexpected situations during the ambush. Looking at these things, Freya touched the ring on her hand. Her heart calmed down slightly. This ruby ring was first given to her by Brando. When she left Bragg's that day, she was worried about Brando's safety, so she returned the ring to him. After a year, when Brando met her again, his strength was no longer the same as before. Naturally, he no longer had any use for the ring, so he returned it to her. This ring had changed hands between the two a few times. It had a deeper meaning to her. Looking at it now, the only things that she could use were the explosive crystals and this ring. The ruby ring could cast a fireball spell once. She had already used it once during the battle yesterday. Right now it was about to be fully charged. However, it was already proven yesterday that the fireball was useless against the monster. She did not have much hope in the explosive crystals. Freya raised her head. The cliff on the side of the canyon was already within reach. When she turned back, the silver monster had already chased her to the bottom of the canyon. The distance between the two of them was less than a kilometer. To the monster, this distance was nothing more than a snap of a finger. Freya took a deep breath. Nervousness seemed to pervade her heart again. But she suddenly remembered that she still had another thing. She hurriedly opened the buckle on the other side of her waist bag. The heavy stone slab was indeed intact in the pocket. She breathed a sigh of relief. This stone slab was given to her by Brando. She still remembered that when Brando gave her this stone slab, he also said those strange words. What goddess of war, what bloodline, she did not understand. Brando also did not explain it to her. But these things coincided with the current situation. Freya suddenly had a glimmer of hope in her heart. Perhaps this thing could help her out of this predicament. But unfortunately, the girl soon found that this stone slab was still the same as before. No matter how she manipulated it, it was indifferent. Or rather, it was no different from a real stone. It was just that in this weather, it had become colder. Freya sighed. More than once, she wondered if Brando had made a mistake. This was clearly just a stone. This kind of stone slab was not rare. In many black markets in Wonde, there were people who would use similar rune stone slabs to trick customers. From ancient documents to rune stone slabs used by the first generation of witches, the only thing they had in common was that they were all fake. Brando won't be fooled, will he? Freya thought about these messy things to distract herself from her nervousness. Even so, she was still trembling violently. When she made this decision before, she did not consider it so thoroughly. But now she was taking a risk. Not only was she putting the fate of herself and everyone's lives in her hands. She did not know if this was a willful commander, but at least she understood this point. When everyone had to take a gamble to fight for the only chance in a hopeless situation, she had to stand up and take on this responsibility. If she failed, she might not only face death, but she might also face suspicion and even bring trouble to Brando. But in the end, she resolutely chose to take this gamble. Brando did not want a mediocre Freya. She was the same. At the same time, she seemed to understand what Maynard wanted in her eyes. In the end, she tried to smear some of the blood on her forehead on the stone slab. Just like in some knights' novels, it was a necessary process to make a divine weapon recognize its master. Although it seemed a little stupid and she did fail in the end, the stone slab did not change at all. For a moment, the girl could not help but feel a little depressed. But in the next moment she suddenly stopped. Freya quietly raised her head and saw the silver figure in front of her. She did not know when, but the monster had circled in front of her. In such a short time, she did not expect the difference in speed between her and the monster to be so great. But this time she did not immediately retreat or turn around to run. Instead, she slowly unsheathed Lionheart. The girl held the sword with both hands and stood still as if she had calmed down. She looked at the monster with her light brown eyes and pointed the tip of the sword at it. Not running anymore? The silver monster opened its mouth and let out a hollow and mocking voice. You disregarded your own safety and led me to this place. Do you want to sacrifice your own life to save your companions? According to the standards of you humans, you can be considered noble. It's a pity that such actions are nothing in the long flow of time in the entire world. Your choice is destined to be meaningless. Freya quietly listened to the monster's mocking words and took the opportunity to slowly calm the pain in her body. She was unmoved and only quietly replied, "Cut the crap, monster." This answer stunned the monster for a moment, and then it laughed maniacally. What are you trying to say? You don't really think that you are the goddess of war, do you? You just have a rare and mottled bloodline in your blood. But that means nothing to you. The silver monster replied contemptuously. All right, little girl, the game is over for you. It raised its hand and its right arm turned into a silver blade and swept towards Freya. Freya had seen this move before. She raised her sword with both hands and blocked the attack. Unfortunately, she had calculated the strength of her sword but not the difference in strength between her and the monster. As soon as the Lionheart came into contact with the monster's right arm, she immediately felt that something was wrong. A force that could topple mountains and overturn seas came from the point of contact. Before she could even react, she was slammed into the snow. Freya crashed heavily into the snow. Although the snow was soft, this impact was more violent than any she had experienced before. She could almost feel the deformation of her breastplate, pressing against her ribs and then breaking them. The broken ribs pierced into her lungs, and the girl could not help but spit out a mouthful of blood. Ugh! Freya spat out a mouthful of blood, but she endured the intense pain and instinctively rolled to the side. As expected, the monster turned its blade into a whip and lashed the spot where she was originally at, causing snow to fly everywhere. The silver monster did not expect a mere silver tear to be so sharp. It was stunned for a moment before it realized that those were all the tricks that it had used before. However, the little girl in front of it had already memorized them by just looking at them. Since it had realized this, it immediately changed its move. It simply turned its right hand into a spear and threw it in the direction where Freya was rolling. It had calculated in advance that Freya would not be able to avoid the attack. However, a dazzling light suddenly shot out from the snowy ground, and a pair of golden wings bloomed from it. With a light flap of the wings, Freya was lifted off the ground and dodged the attack by a hair's breadth. An incomplete form of the goddess of war? The silver monster raised its head. Freya had already flapped her wings and flew into the air. Her eyes were filled with silver light, and the mark of the goddess of war on her forehead flashed once again, shining brightly. She had inadvertently displayed this power in the night tournament before, and then used it again in the battlefield of Ampere Seal. This was the third time she had activated the mark of the goddess of war in actual combat. This time she was obviously much more skilled than the previous 2 times. Ever since she received the Power Stone from Brando, her strength had improved by leaps and bounds. After entering Milo's breath, in fact, she had already entered the upper silver-ranked level, and now she had leaped into the gold-ranked level, although it was with the help of an external power. While the silver monster was slightly stunned, Freya did not dare to delay. She flapped her wings, turned around, and flew directly in the direction of the cliff. Trying to run. The silver monster did not expect the human girl to start fleeing again while it was stunned. It could not help but be shocked and angry and hurriedly chased after her. However, after the transformation of the goddess of war, Freya's speed was much faster, and soon she was close to the cliff. The moment she was close to the cliff, Freya suddenly paused and circled in the air, from the left side of the silver monster to the right side of the cliff. The monster raised its head as if it immediately understood the girl's intention. It was shocked and angry. You dare? Freya did not even look at this guy. Of course, this girl from the countryside of Buchi was very nervous at this moment. She was afraid of missing a step, and did not dare to answer any questions, let alone mock it. She swept across the white snow and circled behind the monster. Then she raised her hand and the ruby ring on her right hand shone brightly. Flame, an unfamiliar word came out of her mouth. The ring lit up and a fireball the size of a wash basin roared out. The fireball did not have any attack power against the monster, but this did not mean that it was not powerful. In fact, when the fireball left a long trail and directly shot towards the cliff above the monster's head, it quickly showed the true horror of this spell. The place where the fireball hit was a thick layer of snow, and the spell just happened to explode at the bottom of the cliff that supported the snow. When the fireball exploded, it produced a huge fireball that almost instantly cracked the cliff, and the snow above rolled down. It looked like an abnormal avalanche was about to happen. But this was not the end. When Freya swept across the snow, she threw the 6 exploding crystals one by one on the pile of snow. When the fireball exploded, it produced a violent magic fluctuation that instantly ignited these unstable energy polymers. At that moment, the cliff suddenly lit up with several bright balls of light, and the sound of the explosion almost shook the entire valley. The cliff that supported the snow suddenly collapsed, and the thousands of years old ice on top of it rushed down like a flood, straight towards the silver monster. Ah, damn it! The silver monster finally let out an angry scream. But Freya suddenly widened her eyes. Because the roar of the monster was not because of panic, but because of anger from being teased. It quickly lowered its head, and 4 long mercury strips extended out from its back like water droplets. These metal strips in the blink of an eye turned into 2 pairs of long silver wings. Can fly. Oh no. The girl's heart was cold. P.S. Is this a surprise? Equals haha, today's mini update will be 7,000 words. How much will it be tomorrow? Chapter 804. The avalanche was like a raging wave coming down head-on, but the silver monster had already spread its wings, flapping its silver wings rapidly like a dragonfly, and then it rose from the ground. The silver monster rushed straight towards her. Freya did not need to calculate to see that with the current speed of the avalanche, the monster could almost certainly avoid it. At that moment, her thoughts flashed like lightning, and almost subconsciously the girl made a decision. The golden wings of light expanded behind her, and she also rose from the ground, and then suddenly rushed towards the silver monster. At that moment, on the silver monster's featureless face, the mocking smile on its big mouth that was like a crescent moon finally froze on its face. "You're crazy," it screamed in panic. Freya was like a golden meteor, crashing head-on into the silver monster in midair. The monster frantically waved its silver blade, trying to force her away. But she was unmoved, did not dodge, and still let the blade cut through her lower abdomen. The half-body armor of the Wind Empress was almost like a thin layer of paper under such an attack, instantly opening a long gash and rose-colored blood sprayed out, but the girl slammed into the silver monster's waist, pushing it back. Her strength was far inferior to the other party, but at this time, there was no need to fight to the death. It was just a momentary obstruction, but it could already decide a lot of things. No, the silver monster's upward momentum only paused for a moment, and the avalanche came crashing down. Ordinary things were as humble as dust under the invincible power of nature. Freya and the silver monster flashed in the snow waves and disappeared. At the other end of the canyon, the battle between the young people of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment and the Pale Sun was entering a white-hot stage. Relying on the guidance of the battle flag planted by Freya, the knights finally gathered together. Their strength was not inferior to these monsters and even stronger. It was just that the Pale Sun relied on the advantage of surprise attacks and numbers to gain the upper hand for a while. And when the Folded Sword Knight Regiment gathered together, and the giant wolves in the forest on the other side lost the command of the silver monster, the battle situation immediately changed. The knights began to fight in the narrow, advantageous position of the canyon, and planned to resist the attack of the winter wolves. After both sides suffered a lot of losses, the battle also turned from a surprise attack into a stalemate. This was good news for the humans who were at a disadvantage at first, but the waves of attacks from the Pale Sun still made them tired. After Brund was snatched back by Aaliyah and Maynard, he had already fallen into a coma. Maynard wanted to find Freya, but she was surrounded by wolves with the others, and obviously could not get away for a while. Little Pero brought Rollo and the others back from the other side. Their losses were even heavier, almost everyone was injured, especially after a night of pursuit. At this moment, even the most tenacious Kurlutzians could not help but gasp for breath. Everyone's expression didn't look too good. However, Rollo stared at the other side of the canyon nervously. "Did you hear something?" Little Pero asked immediately when he saw his expression. He knew that Pero was a mountain man, and among all the people here, his perception was the sharpest. "I think I heard an explosion." Pero's forehead was full of cold sweat, which was caused by excessive physical exertion. His eyes were a little gray, but after listening for a while he still answered weakly. "Is it reinforcements?" Someone asked loudly. "I'm afraid it's impossible. It was Miss Commander who made it." Little Pero shook his head and replied. Maynard frowned. She knew that Freya had the explosive crystal and the ruby ring on her. Freya had left for at least a quarter of an hour, and there was no news of her so far. The monster did not look back. She knew very well the gap between Freya and the monster. Even if Freya had activated the mark of the Valkyrie, it would not be much harder for the monster to deal with her than it was for Aaliyah and Brund. It was not a battle on the same level of power at all. "I think you'd better worry about yourselves first." Aaliyah was covered in blood as he sat next to Brund, panting heavily. The new wounds on his body were left when he rescued Brund. If the wounds left on him by the pale sun last night were only a small memorial, then he could be said to have received a 1-ton medal at this moment. Aaliyah had completely lost his combat effectiveness, and if the Folded Sword Knight Regiment were to evacuate at this time, he and Brund would have to stay here. But even so, it did not change his temperament. He was as annoying as ever. This guy was as jinxed as ever, but this time things did not develop as he expected. Suddenly, the knight in front let out a cry of surprise. Little Pero seemed to feel something and immediately separated the human wall and walked out. He saw a strange scene playing out in front of everyone. He saw that the pale suns near and far suddenly staggered and stopped on the path of attack. They seemed to be drunk as they fell to the ground one by one, and then black smoke rose from their bodies as if they were evaporating in broad daylight. They turned into ashes little by little, and finally, only black magic crystals were left in the snow. This scene did not just happen to one or a group of giant wolves, but hundreds of pale suns near and far fell to the ground at the same time, then turned into black smoke and dissipated. Such a spectacular scene stunned almost every knight present. As expected, these monsters are all summoned creatures. Little Pero immediately reacted, "Looks like our commander has done something incredible." He turned his head and looked at Maynard. But the female knight's face did not show the slightest relief. She slowly took out the communication crystal from her collar. The communication crystal was gray, representing Freya's end, which did not light up because of her infusion of magic. However, in the canyon, Freya's communication crystal, which was scattered next to a pile of snow, was indeed glowing. This meant that someone was trying to establish contact with the necklace through the net of law, but unfortunately the owner of the necklace was not by its side. Freya almost struggled to climb out from under the snow on the other side. She groaned softly. Her physical condition was worse than she had imagined. Bruises and abrasions covered her body, and the blood oozing from the wound on her lower abdomen almost stained the armor under her armor. There was a huge dent in her breastplate and blood kept oozing out from the crack. The corners of her eyes, nose and mouth were also bleeding. She coughed softly a few times. Fortunately, she and the monster were on top of the avalanche and she was above the monster. But when the two were swept into the snow, she saw with her own eyes that the monster was sucked into the vortex under the rubble and rolling snow, and she was lucky to escape with her life. But even so, it only lasted for a while. Freya could feel how serious her injuries were. The fatal injuries came from the impact on her chest and the sword wound on her lower abdomen. The excessive blood loss made her dizzy, and her hands and feet were a little cold, especially in such an environment. What made the girl feel most bitter was that she found that her waist pouch containing the holy water was lost in the avalanche. "Am I going to die?" She turned over and lay quietly in the snow, quietly looking at the sky. She knew very well how far she was from Maynard and the others, and Cruz would not be able to make it in time. She felt that the cold had begun to numb her body and heart, and drowsiness and tiredness came in waves. "Fortunately, I did not fail." Freya sighed softly in her heart. This was the boldest decision and the craziest action she had ever done in her life, but she was not that person. This was the only time and also the last time. She closed her eyes and in the darkness, there seemed to be countless spots of light. These spots of light gathered one by one, and the shadow of the mountains of Bucci appeared, and then gathered to form the face of that person. Brando. Freya's heart was peaceful and she quietly waited for the moment to come. But the heavens did not seem to want to give the girl this special honor. Just as she closed her eyes slightly, there was a soft cracking sound in the snow. The sound was not loud, but to Freya, it was no less than a clap of thunder. She abruptly opened her eyes and struggled to turn her head. Sure enough, she saw a gray arm sticking out from under the snow. "How is this possible?" Freya whispered in her heart. Under the snow there could not be a second person other than the monster. She subconsciously reached out to grab the Lionheart sword, but the monster's reaction was faster than her. With a loud bang, as if a huge force had exploded from under the snow, a black shadow shot out from under the snow, and instantly pressed down on Freya. The silver monster had one hand around Freya's neck, and the other hand pressed down on her hand that was holding the sword. It lowered its head and coldly looked at the human girl who had made it so miserable. Compared to Freya, it was indeed more miserable. At this moment, it was no longer as glorious as before, and there was only one wing left on its back. Its mercury-like body was no longer smooth and flawless, but was now covered with potholes and scars. Its originally silver skin was now extremely dull, and almost turned into a metallic gray color. Freya had seen this color in the battle last night. Usually, when the battle reached this stage, the monster would choose to absorb a person's life force. This meant that once it was in this state, it was only a step away from death. "That's such a pity," Freya thought helplessly. She could clearly feel her remaining life force being slowly drained by the monster's hand. She could still squint at the terrifying monster, but soon she felt that even breathing became difficult. Freya's breathing gradually quickened. The silver monster sneered. "Your race is as cunning as they were thousands of years ago." It squatted down beside Freya, and then grabbed the girl by the neck and lifted her up, as if it wanted to enjoy the scene of Freya dying from lack of oxygen. But it was this action that caused the stone slab in Freya's pouch to fall out with a thud. The silver monster was slightly stunned. It looked at the stone slab and seemed to be surprised. "What is this? Wait, this is..." It instinctively picked up the slate with its other hand, but just as it let go of Freya's sword, the girl, who had been waiting for a long time, used the last of her strength to yell, "Monster!" She held the sword with both hands and stabbed at the monster's lower abdomen. Perhaps the silver monster noticed Freya's action, or perhaps it did not expect it at all, and the sword sank directly into its abdomen. It was slightly stunned. It raised its head and looked at the human girl in front of it with a strange expression. "You don't think this kind of scrap metal can hurt me, do you? The attacks of you mortals have no effect on me." It patted the girl's face mockingly. "Ignorant." Freya's narrowed eyes were only left with raging anger. She stared at the monster's faceless face, and looked at the crescent-like mouth that was sneering, and wished that she could kill it with a single strike. But in the next moment, her prayer seemed to be heard by an unknown god. Suddenly, the silver monster's crescent-like mouth drooped down. It was as if an unusually painful expression appeared on its face. It suddenly screamed, threw Freya away, covered its wound, and frantically retreated. The Lionheart sword in its lower abdomen suddenly emitted raging flames, and the flames followed the wound and burned its entire body. "This is impossible," the monster wailed as it knelt on the ground. "Damn the mark of the goddess of war." Ah. The silver monster turned into a ball of fire in the blink of an eye, but unfortunately Freya did not get to enjoy the results of her battle. The moment she was thrown to the ground, she felt a blazing flame spreading from her heart to her entire body, and instantly she was in great pain. But Freya did not say a word. Instead, her eyes were filled with disbelief, because she knew what this meant. The golden flame had been ignited, and beside her, the stone slab in the snow bloomed with the most dazzling light at this moment. P.S. I'm so excited that I forgot to say the name. Blackie's book title is Calamity Descends, Forceful Push. Today is the day of the ranking. Everyone help to support. Throw in any recommendations you have. Chapter 805. Everyone doesn't seem to trust my integrity. I'm very sad. I've decided to write a new chapter to condemn everyone. Continue to recommend Blackie's Calamity Descends. I don't believe he can write a new chapter today. The traces of artificial carvings were immersed in the darkness. Rows of pillars extended in front and back at equal intervals. Looking up along the narrow radial embedded in the cliff, these pillars shortened one by one at the far end of the field of vision and overlapped together. The smooth wall seemed to be paved with obsidian, but it was covered with a lattice network used to transmit energy. It was no different from what Brando had seen under Valhalla, and it was no different from the material of the remains of Milos scattered in the glaciers on the ground. In fact, such materials could be seen everywhere in the ruins of Wound, and the only thing players knew about them was that they came from the previous era. It looked like a long corridor, and in a past era, it might have been called that. But now only half of the corridor remained. No one knew what kind of disaster it had experienced, but it was cut in the middle, and on the other side was only a bottomless abyss. The corridor was embedded in the precipice, winding to the ground. In the game this was called the Cold Corridor. A group of people was slowly passing through this half of the corridor that came from before the previous era, or even the era of chaos. In this group, a blonde girl was holding the face of a chubby little man next to her and leading the group. It was Alaz and Sheeta. Brando and Veronica followed closely behind, while the scholar girl followed closely behind the female commander. When the frost-covered road became dangerous, she no longer asked Brando some strange questions from time to time. In fact, everyone became more careful. A body's distance behind the three of them, Scarlet was carrying a bag taller than herself. She did not say a word, but her waist-length crimson ponytail occasionally swayed slightly with the girl's steps. Of course, there was no need for her to go through so much trouble. At Brendel's request, the Buga craftsman had already cast an illusion spell on the Azure Lance. The Buga people's law enforcers of the secret realm had spent their entire lives studying illusions. They were known as the Guardians of the Silver Holy Wall and were the most outstanding illusionist in the Amber Sword other than the Thousand-Faced Man. Their illusions generally required an existence 2 realms higher than them to see through the flaws. The spellcaster this time was the leader of the secret realm's law enforcers, one of the leaders of the Silver Union's wizards, Roan. His strength was on par with William's, and other than the Sage of Eloranta, there was probably no one in this world who was 2 realms higher than him in the field of magic. Brando was not worried that Eloranta would come to Erwin to expose his trick. Behind them was the little prince. The future king of Erwin stumbled along the way, his nose bruised and his face swollen. If he was still in the palace, there would be servants to help him forward. Of course, that was if the strict sister was not around. At this moment, the Shire, Hipamera, and Medisha surrounded him, but did not lend a hand. In fact, the youngest wizard mentor in Erwin's history was snickering, and Medisha could not help but secretly purse her lips. They were only responsible for protecting the little prince from accidentally falling into the abyss. As for the rest, it was probably Brando's orders. Behind them were Lorena and her husband, the eldest prince of Cruz, and a large number of Cruz nobles, as well as a group of witches led by Babasha and the other 2 witch leaders. Walking at the end of the team was the Ash Sword Saint. As the most powerful existence in the team, Mephisto's main responsibility was to be responsible for covering the rear. No one could guarantee absolute safety in this abyss. Even Brando could not say that he knew the big dungeon in this game. Not to mention that he had never really gone deep into this kind of place. Who knew if there would be any changes here in the real Woned world? After gradually getting used to this world, Brando could be sure that this world, also named Woned, was not the world in the game, nor was it a phantom or a dream. Although he once wondered if someone had played a malicious joke on him, or if this was a Truman's world, as time went by he no longer held any illusions and began to call this world the real Woned. The laws of operation of everything in this world were more in line with nature than in the game. Although there were some similarities and differences, it seemed more realistic. Although a real game world was somewhat incredible. After passing through the underground glacier, Sheeta indeed brought them to the underground entrance of the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator, which was actually not far from the place where Peya's brother slipped and fell. This made Brendel a little suspicious, always feeling that there was something in the dark leading them here. In particular, Erek obviously did not take this shortcut under the glacier, so why Peya's brother was in this place was worth discussing. It was a pity that the Hunter siblings were still unconscious and there was no way to get to the bottom of it. He had also heard about the underground entrance of the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator. The part above the abyss was called White Gorge, and it was the only entrance outside the main entrance of the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator. It was divided into 2 parts, underground and above ground. The above ground led to the Jiwei Glacier where the Frost Devourer was entrenched, and the underground led to this cold walkway. Brando slowly moved forward with the team, and as he walked, he placed his hand on the ice-blue corridor pillars embedded in frost. There was one about every 5 to 6 meters, protruding from the wall like ribs. These pillars were cold to the touch, heavy and realistic, and slightly different from the simulated feeling in the game. Although Brando had never been here, he knew this material. When he touched it in the game, there would be a special touch, as if he could feel the tragic war and malice from the previous era. Not only in his hands but even in his heart there would be a chill. This was the atmosphere created by the game's special emotional system. But here there was no such feeling. These pillars were like ordinary stone products and they felt heavy to the touch. So this is the feeling. Brando had a strange feeling in his heart. Even if this was a dangerous trip for him, the feeling of being able to personally experience the world in the game was very interesting to him. The female commander noticed his unusual behavior and asked in a low voice, "You've been here before?" Brando was so shocked that his hand almost slipped, and he quickly replied, "Of course not." "Oh. Then why do you look like you're revisiting an old place?" Veronica replied impatiently. This little guy was always vague and it made her very dissatisfied. "That's because I've seen the corridor here, these pillars and walls." Brando exhaled and replied, "You've seen it before where?" "In the book." For this answer, Brando didn't need to think about the reason, as if it was a matter of course, on the forum or in the book. "Today when I saw this corridor, these pillars, they confirmed with what I've seen in the book. When I measured these pillars with my own hands, I understood that this was the case." This reason was reasonable. Although the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator was a forbidden area, it was not that no one had ever set foot in it in history. The Myurnas had once passed through this place, and the Buga wizards and the Mist Elves had also followed the footsteps of the Myurnas to this place. About a dozen years later, the Black Flame disciples occupied this holy cathedral, making this holy cathedral a famous dungeon in the future. Veronica had long heard about this holy cathedral, but she still looked at Brando with some suspicion. Did the Wizard of the Tower really have such a vast amount of information? This little guy always pushed all the reasons to the literature collected by the Wizard of the Tower. The Wizard of the Tower split from the Silver Bugas, and she didn't believe that they always migrated with the literature of the Bugas. It was a pity that the Cruz Empire had no friendship with the Wizard of the Tower, otherwise she would have found a way to verify it. Now she could only be skeptical of Brando's statement. At this time Shido, who was following behind the two, suddenly said, "Seeing the things in the book appear in front of my eyes, I understand that this is the case. After all, the written description is integrated with the subjective wishes of the author. Only when you see it with your own eyes can you understand it." Her eyes lit up. This last sentence was the reason why she left the academy to go to Erewhon. "Like the Count, I have gained a lot today." The scholar lady seemed to have understood some profound truth and replied with some excitement. Veronica sighed and felt that what Shido said seemed to have some sense. She took one last look at Brando and no longer continued to question. Brando was relieved, but the shrewdness and keenness of this female army commander still made him feel a little ridiculous. However, he also realized that he should be more careful, so he withdrew his hand and stopped touching anything in the corridor. He looked up. The forum said that this cold corridor was about 30 minutes away, and now they were almost half the distance. The second half of the corridor went from the underground to the interior of the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator. Brando pursed his lips. The second two-thirds of the corridor was the range of activity of the Twilight Twins, Mare and Main. He had been waiting for the two black wolves to appear for a while. Mare and Main were the last generation of the Twilight Wolves. They were born from Ekka's seventh daughter, Jianghu. Jianghu was the ruler of the Moon of Eternal Darkness, so the power of the twins was mostly related to shadow and darkness. Mare and Main looked very similar in appearance. To outsiders they looked like giant black wolves with long horns on their foreheads. However, Main lost his left eye in the battle with the Dragon of Disaster, so he only had one eye left. There was also a long scar in his left eye socket that could be used to distinguish him from his brother. These two wolves were optional bosses in the Amber Sword because they were imprisoned in the secret passage under the Holy Cathedral that led to the surface. It was the cold corridor where Brando was now. If you chose to enter the Holy Cathedral from the main entrance, you would not encounter them. As optional bosses to guard the secret passage, Mare and Main were definitely one of the strongest bosses in the first 4 acts of the game. If it was in the game, Brando would most likely want to avoid them, but now he was very much looking forward to the appearance of these two beasts immediately. There was no other reason. When the team had existences like Mare, Veronica, and the little female dragon, Mare and Main, who were very troublesome to the players, were now a moving treasure trove for him. His nominal teacher, Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles, had already stepped into the extreme planes. He was even one step further than he was in the game. Brando had no doubt that he alone could easily deal with the Twilight Twins. The Twilight Twins drop list was second only to the final boss of this dungeon. The only problem was that these two stupid wolves did not necessarily appear. Brando could only pray that he was lucky enough. For now it was still quiet all around. Only the creaking of everyone's footsteps on the ice and snow could be heard. He pursed his lips and looked around. Hippamera and Lorena behind her held torches in their hands. Except for the flickering light of the torches that could illuminate a small area, the end of their vision was pitch black. And it was at this time that he saw Alaz pulling Sheeta's ear to stop. The little female dragon stopped because she found a door in front of her. She narrowed her golden eyes and looked at the stone door. To be exact, it was not a complete door because like the cold corridor, this stone door only had half of it left. The other half of it may have been broken along with the corridor in the past and fallen into the abyss below in a disaster. The rest of it was also shattered, leaving the broken part stuck in the corridor. The little female dragon turned her head and looked at Sheeta. What's behind this and why is there a door here? How would I know? The little fat dragon muttered in dissatisfaction. I've never been inside this temple. My task is only to lead you to the entrance under the glacier. That's what you promised him. I don't care. You have to find that awakening god who's pretending to be a ghost. Also, you have to find the heart of the dragon that you lost. Alaz ordered unreasonably. Wait, Sister Alaz, that's not the heart of the dragon. What does the heart of the dragon have to do with me? I mean, you have to get that fun toy back for me? The little female dragon bared her teeth and glared at Sheeta. The latter shuddered and immediately shrunk his neck and did not answer. Brando heard the conversation between the two and automatically ignored the latter part. However, Alaz seemed to be very interested in the awakening god, which made him a little suspicious. Was it because of her own interest or was it because of other reasons? Alaz was a young dragon and was very undisciplined in her actions. However, the dragons had always shouldered special responsibilities in the game as the Golden Race. At least they had fought against the Dusk. Not only the Golden Race, as far as Brando knew, the Bugas had also built many monitoring stations to monitor the borders of Order and the Black Forest. According to Medisha, the Silver Elves were not completely indifferent to worldly affairs, otherwise they would not have returned to Wone because of the arrival of the Great Demonic Wave. It seemed that except for the Black Dwarves, the ancestors all acted for their own purposes. Thinking of this, Brando could not help but look at Alaz again. Alaz was in front instructing Sheeta to push the stone door. Although the stone door was heavy, it was nothing to the dragons. The broken stone door retreated under Sheeta's round claws, revealing half of the hall behind. Or rather, it was more like a square because most of the ceiling had collapsed, and although only half of the hall was left, it was still ridiculously large. There was a square with a fountain outside Erwin's golden silk palace, but compared to the remaining half of the hall, it paled in comparison. Brando and the others stood outside the door of the hall and could barely see the other side of the hall. Brando saw this and suddenly realized where they were. At this time, a shadow flashed behind the door, and Sheeta suddenly screamed as if he was hit by something head-on. He turned into a ball and rolled back until he hit a pillar. Who is it? The little female dragon's shocked and angry voice came from the front. Although she often bared her fangs and brandished her claws at Sheeta, that was an internal dispute of the dragons. Dragons were proud creatures and not just anyone could bully them at will. Especially this thing that actually sent Sheeta flying in front of her, it was simply unbearable. However, the black shadow jumped back and stopped. Only then did the people behind clearly see that it wasn't a person, but a wolf. A male wolf. Veronica could not help but blurt out. It was indeed a bit like the male wolf that Brando had seen in Valhalla. Its physique was like a hill almost occupying half of the hall. Its soft long hair drooped behind its neck like a black brocade, but the only difference between it and the black wolf was that it had a long horn on its forehead. The horn was dense with black smoke, and one could tell at a glance that it was not an ordinary thing. This is not a male wolf, this is a dusk wolf. Brando was pleasantly surprised. The bosses in the Amber Sword were more intelligent, and he was really worried that these two beasts would not be fooled and appear. But stupid wolves were stupid wolves, and since Mare appeared, then the one-eyed mane must not be too far away. And at the same time he also knew where this place was. The Hall of Traps. When the little female dragon saw the beast in front of her, she immediately roared and pounced. She could feel that the strength of this twilight great wolf was about the same as her own, but she was a dragon, one of the races that were best at fighting among the golden races. In Alaz's mind, no matter how powerful this stupid wolf was, it could not be stronger than her, and she needed to, whether it was to protect her unquestionable authority in front of Sheeta, or the pride of the dragons, she needed to be the first to rush up and teach this uninvited guest a lesson. But she did not expect that just as she was about to pounce, Brando behind her realized that things were not going well. He wanted to warn her, but unfortunately the little female dragon moved too quickly. As soon as the latter moved, layers of green lightning appeared on the ceiling and floor of the hall. These lightning bolts seemed to have a life of their own. As soon as they appeared, they went straight for Alaz. The dragon race had a passive talent, resistant scales. Dragon scales were extremely resistant to both magic and physical attacks. 1 or 2 lightning bolts would have no effect on Alaz at all. But at this moment, there were thousands of lightning bolts, almost like a stormy sea, directly drowning the little female dragon, leaving only a scream. Ah! Brando could not help but cover his face. Why else did she think this place was called the Hall of Traps? Chapter 806. Moral integrity has been delivered, perfectly picked up, touched. Catastrophe descends, is being promoted by Sanjiang this week. If anyone has any recommendations, please go support them. Why are you so cool? Alaz sat on the ground with smoke curling up, and no one dared to approach her. The little female dragon's golden eyes were burning with anger, and people suspected that she would turn into a dragon in the next moment and vent her anger on them. Brando also wisely kept his mouth shut. If he now told her that this was actually called the Hall of Traps, a famous scene in the game, and that 1/3 of the difficulty of the battle with the Twilight Twins was counted in this hall, then Alaz would definitely think that he must be mocking her. What a joke! The little female dragon's temper was not very good. At this time, if he said that, maybe she would really turn into a dragon and eat him. Brando raised his eyebrows after serious consideration, and decided to keep his mouth shut. Mare was already dead, and that was the consequence of angering a dragon. Alaz and the Twilight Twins were comparable in strength, but the bad thing was that Mare did not expect the furious Alaz at all. But when the little female dragon suddenly turned into a golden dragon and slapped the black wolf away, the wolf may not have had time to react, and it was already rolling down the abyss. The speed was so fast that it could be said to be the fastest boss to die in the Amber Sword. Brando came to the edge of the cliff and glanced at the place where Mare fell. It was a pity that was half the fall and it was gone just like that. And at this time he heard a cold voice ask, "What did you say that beast was called?" It was Alaz's voice and his heart suddenly thumped. He did not intend to provoke the little female dragon in a rage, but the latter did not seem to intend to let him go. Mare Fess. Mare Fess, the Twilight Twins of the Twilight Wolves. Alaz suddenly giggled and immediately made Brando feel a little creeped out. He even began to wonder if the little female dragon was electrocuted by the lightning trap to the point that she became deranged. But the latter narrowed her golden eyes and replied, "The legendary leader of the Twilight Wolves is no match for me. It seems that I can go through with my coming-of-age ceremony." Damn. Brando was stunned. He had seen arrogant people, but he had never seen such a boastful one. Anyone with a discerning eye could see that Mare was still in a sealed state, and what was exposed was not his true strength. After all, this was the holy cathedral of the Hibernator, and if outside, 10 Alaz would not necessarily be able to beat any one of the Twilight Twins. However, he had never heard of what the Dragon Clan's coming-of-age ceremony was like. If one wanted to challenge a monster whose strength exceeded one's own, he could not help but glance at Alaz, wondering if she would really use Mare to complete her coming-of-age ceremony. The Dragon Clan could not be so unreliable. Why, do you have a problem with that? Alaz's tone changed and immediately there was a hint of danger. No, why would I? Brando turned away from the edge of the cliff. Of course, this was mainly because he was afraid that the little female dragon would suddenly go berserk and slap him down to accompany Mare. That would be too much of a loss. He moved away from the edge of the cliff, and this movement did not escape the eyes of the Shire. The young wizard attendant immediately betrayed his lord, and beside him, the silver elf princess who was more familiar with Brando, could not help but snicker. Only the priestess of the lofty mountains, Hippamera, was somewhat incredulous and asked very innocently, "My lord, he wouldn't do that, right?" Shido also nodded at the side. In her eyes, Brando was already a true scholar of noble character. The Shire could only shrug at these two little girls who had not yet been tainted by Brando. At this time, Brando had already walked to the other side of Alaz and changed the topic. "Speaking of which, the Dragon Clan's coming-of-age ceremony isn't that childish, right?" "What do you mean by childish?" Alaz was very unhappy after hearing Brando's words, but she saw that the cunning human had already left the edge of the cliff, and could only snort twice. After all, for a moment she really wanted to slap Brando down too. Did he think that she did not know that this guy was definitely aware of the previous trap? How dare he not remind her? The little female dragon bared her teeth. Since the Silver Age, the number of giant dragons has been decreasing again and again, and the age of adulthood has been lowered. I'm already old enough to undergo the coming-of-age ceremony, but I have to first kill a dusk species stronger than me to qualify, and then take another test. So it's just to qualify, Brando thought in his heart. It seemed that the Dragon Clan's coming-of-age ceremony was not that childish, but it was actually to kill a dusk species, and not a monster as he thought. The dusk species were very common before the era of chaos. Before the dusk dragon fell, these terrible ancestors of magic were all over the continent. But now, only in these ancient ruins could one see the silhouettes of the dusk species, and the powerful dusk species were hard to find. After the azure nights separated the sky, the leaders of the Chaos Army were either dead or sealed. Thousands of years later in Vaunt, their silhouettes could no longer be seen. Allah saw Brando's expression and knew what he was thinking and snorted coldly, "Do you think the dusk dragon is really dead?" At the border of civilization, in the world outside the Black Forest, creatures from chaos are not rare, and those powerful ones are beyond your imagination. Brando was not surprised that the dusk dragon was not dead, and after the Slate War there were many clues pointing to this evidence. In fact, in a long history the dusk dragon was defeated more than once, and it was entirely possible that it was just dormant, waiting for the next opportunity to revive. Otherwise, if the dusk dragon was dead, those followers of chaos who respected it would not be so fanatical. Moreover, Brando also knew that the dusk dragon did not have a physical body, but a manifestation of the rules. Just like the world of Wond, where there was order, there was chaos. The two were not only opposite but also dependent on each other. When Allah said this, he understood the world outside the Black Forest even the players of the previous world had not been to. If there was something there, he could understand. Allah's continued proudly, "When Mr. Mephisto kills that one-eyed wolf, I'll take it as the result of the exam, the twin of dusk. The elders will definitely pass, then my results can be said to be the most glorious of the dragons in 100 years. Wait, aren't you the one who killed them?" Brendel's jaw dropped. "So what?" Allah's rolled her eyes. "Do they know? Who will tell them, you? Or those cruise people?" The way the little female dragon rolled her eyes was surprisingly cute. At least this was one of the rare times Brando saw her act like a young girl, but she immediately showed her white teeth to threaten others. What a joke. Of course Brando would not tell on her. There was no benefit to telling on her. No, it was almost certain that he would be retaliated against by Allah's. He could ignore it, but his territory would be in trouble. Imagine there was an evil dragon near your territory, not even a dragon. Allah's only needed to instruct Sheeta to find a nearby mountain to squat, and then every 2 or 3 days the merchants would be attacked and lose their food supplies. That was not something he could bear. After all, the current Tanajal was barely relying on commerce to prosper. If the trade route was hit, it would not be long before it returned to being poor. As for those cruise people, if they wanted to tell on him, would they be able to find the habitat of the dragons? That was not a sad little country like Erewhon, where you could come and go as you please. But in any case, he still felt that it was a bit too strange. Did the dragons not care about their coming-of-age ceremony at all? He stared at Allah suspiciously. The latter replied slowly, "I can see it as an adventure with you. So this is what it means to team up." Brando could finally be sure. The so-called coming-of-age ceremony of the dragons seemed to be such a child's play. And just when he was a little speechless at the strange coming-of-age ceremony of the dragons, there was finally news that Mephisto and Veronica had joined forces to kill the one-eyed dragon, Maine. Speaking of which, this unlucky dusk wolf should be considered an honor, to have a sword saint in the ultimate realm, a sword saint at the peak of the law, and at the same time, an Imperial Army commander to hunt it down together. In the game, Brando could not count the number of people who had this kind of honor. The messenger was a young knight. This was also at the request of Veronica, because Mephisto was now considered one of Brando's people, so Maine was considered to be killed by the Cruise people and Erewhon people together. The spoils were also divided between the two sides. The Cruise people hoped to get Maine's magic crystal and blood. The level of the magic crystal of a monster of Maine's level was quite shocking, almost the same level as the dragon. Veronica also had a good plan, but unfortunately, Brando also knew that Maine and Mare's drop list was also top level, the highest level of the world boss level drops. Although the level itself was relatively low, the higher level drops were not available at his level, so he went with the flow and divided the equipment drops. He asked the knight some simple questions, then took Lorena and her husband to where Veronica and the Ash Sword Saint were. Maine did not escape far, and was stabbed to death by Mephisto outside the corridor at the other end of the hall. This was after the Ash Sword Saint and Veronica had deliberately tracked it for a period of time. Otherwise, with the strength of Brando's nominal teacher, it was afraid that it would have been beheaded as soon as it moved. When Brando came to the side of the huge corpse, he saw that the monster's head had a big hole. Presumably the magic crystal had been dug out. He looked up at Veronica. The female Legion commander was smiling. She must have had a good harvest. She saw Brando's gaze turn and quickly replied, "Little guy, if you want, I'll give you the blood of this monster as well. You know, the Holy War is coming, and the high-grade magic crystal is too important for the Empire." Brando was a little amused by this. Of course he knew the role of the high-grade magic crystal, mainly used to power those top-grade magic weapons. In the Holy War, the Holy Cathedral of Fire would definitely put in all its efforts. This was a fight for religious power, there was no room for retreat. But Veronica's behavior was a little too outrageous. He couldn't help but wonder what level of magic crystal she had gotten. But Brando also knew that the female Legion commander would never tell him. He looked back at the Ash Sword Saint. Mephisto nodded to him and gestured. Damn. When Brando saw it, he couldn't help but curse his luck. It was actually the same level as the Dragon Crystal. This way the Holy Cathedral of Fire's top-grade war machines would have a source of power. But he was not jealous at all. The high-grade magic crystal did not mean much to him, although it could provide a source of energy for Valhalla's growth, but low-grade magic crystals could also do the same. There was no need to be so extravagant as to use such a priceless thing. The blood is not necessary. I hope the Empire will remember the contributions of Her Royal Highness and I, and not make things difficult for us at a critical time, Brando replied faintly. To be honest, he was not interested in Maine's blood. Although the blood of the Dusk species was considered the blood of high-level magical creatures and was a material for making many high-level equipment, it was different from magical crystals. No matter how high the level of the blood of chaos creatures was and how much energy it contained, it was still not considered a top-notch material. There was no other reason because it was too mottled, and the top-grade blood was still the golden blood. If possible, Brando had already planned how to get some blood from Alas. Of course, this plan was a bit unrealistic. The little female dragon's temper was too bad, and now it seemed that maybe Sheeta was more reliable. And since he had the little fat dragon as a top-grade mobile blood bank, why would he be interested in other mottled blood? Veronica heard Brando's answer and couldn't help but shake her head with a wry smile. She understood what Brando was saying, but the Empire's decision was not something she could change. Griffin wanted to revive the kingdom, which was contrary to the interests of the Empire, and the Empire could not change its mind for a mere piece of top-grade magic crystal. Of course, in any case, she would not hand over the benefits she had obtained, so she decided to keep her mouth shut and act shamelessly, which was one of the privileges of a lady. Brendel walked directly to Maine's corpse, lifted its huge claw with his hand, and then turned to Lorena, who was not far away, and said, "Miss Lorena, can I borrow your fiancé for a moment?" The female knight's face was red. "What nonsense are you talking about?" she replied bitterly, slapping Philas hard, and the latter had already come to Brando's side with a grin. In the Amber Sword, low-grade beasts did not have a list of equipment drops, and their drops were generally their own materials such as bones, fur, and blood, and if it was a magical creature, magic crystals would be added. However, high-grade beasts were different. Magical creatures with dark magic would generally collect some magic items, and a few such as dragons would still carry them, while others would store them with magic. The same was true for the Twilight Wolves. Brando knew that they generally hid their spoils in the magic space opened up in their claws. Philas tapped the tip of Maine's claws with his hand, and with a click, something seemed to fall from the air and landed on the ground. Everyone present looked down and suddenly found that it was a somewhat strange golden pocket watch. Why was it somewhat strange? It was because the pocket watch had no cover and only half of the dial was left. There were only minute and hour hands on the dial and no hands, but even so, it was still ticking as if it was not damaged, or that only half of the gears in the dial were operating as usual. Standing on Brando's side, one could clearly see the delicate internal components exposed on one side of the pocket watch. Some of the gears at the fracture were only left with half, but it did not seem to affect its operation. When Brando saw this thing, his vision suddenly went black. Holy sh*T. He couldn't help but scream in his heart. The elapsed needle, a subdivine artifact, the top drop in Maine's dropped list. Philas lived up to his title as the face fighter. With a casual touch, he was able to find the 1 in 10,000 chance. But that was not the crux of the problem. It was something else that almost made him vomit blood. That was, the pocket watch itself could not be considered a subdivine artifact. To be precise, it should be a set of subdivine artifacts. The elapsed needle, the backtrack dial. When these two pocket watches were combined into one, they could be called a complete subdivine artifact. But the problem now was that in theory these two things appeared together every time, but Mare, who should have dropped the backtrack dial, had been slapped into the abyss by Alas. The abyss under the glacier led directly to the sulfur river under the beehive. How was he going to get his body back? He was afraid that he would have become a meal on the demon's plate. Brando suddenly felt like crying. Since he came to this world, the number of bosses he had fought was in the double digits. It was not easy for a subdivine artifact to appear, but he did not expect it to be only half. Only half. And it was the most tragic half, the elapsed needle. Elapsed needle. When you activate the elapsed needle, time will accelerate with you as the reference. You can achieve the same effect as time acceleration. The acceleration is up to you, but it cannot exceed 10 times. When time is accelerated, any time-based effect, such as cooldown, charging, recovery, will also be accelerated. Time acceleration will double the elapsed time of your life. When you activate the elapsed needle, you will lose 1,000th of your total experience per second. Every time the acceleration is doubled, the speed of your experience elapsed will also double. Backtrack dial. When you activate the backtrack dial, time will begin to flow back with you as the reference. Time will return to the state you were in 10 minutes ago. All of your statuses, life status, experience, and all other statuses based on time, will be reset to the moment recorded in time. After the backtrack dial is used, it takes 72 hours to recharge. Without the elapsed needle of the backtrack dial, it was an artifact that could delete one's account. It claimed that using it for 2 minutes could completely return you to the existence before liberation. Brando had 1,000 words in his heart at this moment, but they were not as urgent as the desire to rush back and bite the little female dragon to death. Can't we just fight the monsters properly? Chapter 807. In the pitch-black hall, only a beam of white light shone down from the dome, illuminating the cold marble floor. Several black-robed corpses were strewn all over the floor. Fresh blood flowed out from the sword wounds on their necks and flowed along the circular grooves on the marble floor, forming a strange symbol. The scarlet blood flowed slowly, making this scene look like the evil ritual used to summon demons in legends. When the blood completely merged together, it suddenly seemed to have a life of its own. It flowed against the current and extended to the center of the magic circle, converging into the body of the elegant creature above the magic circle. In the next moment, the white wolf seemed to have gradually awakened from a long slumber. His body began to move. Then, starting from its head, its snow-white fur began to roll backward, as if a fur coat was being peeled off. First, a beautiful girl's head was revealed. Her long hair was as dazzling as black sandalwood. Then it was followed by a pair of delicate shoulders and milk-white skin. Her delicate curves were revealed to everyone as the fur fell off her body bit by bit. The girl's flawless body finally appeared in front of everyone. Her eyes were tightly closed, as if her soul was trapped in an eternal dream. Only the slight rise and fall of her chest proved that the eldest daughter of Ekis had not truly died. There was quite a commotion in the hall, and some people even breathed heavily. Ko Hua's eyelashes shook slightly, like the stamens of a flower that had just bloomed. Then she opened her eyes, revealing a pair of silver eyes that were hazy. She got up from the ground lazily, and her long hair that was scattered on the ground was tied up, like a black waterfall flowing against the current. The girl raised her head and looked at the people in front of her with confusion. "Who are you?" The voice was cold and charming, but it was so cold that it was frightening. Dim Ko Hua, the legendary eldest daughter of Ekis, the ruler of the proud moon, and also one of the 12 wolves of the twilight. It was rumored that she had died in the Battle of Babel Fortress. However, at this moment, this famous name in history was no longer a symbol that could stop children from crying. She had returned to the land of Wond and awakened from her eternal slumber. Erek took a deep breath and suppressed the excitement in his heart. He stepped forward and said, "Lord Ko Hua, we are all followers of the truth." "Oh," Ko Hua said softly, "I see. You welcome me back because you want to reactivate the twilight, right?" "Yes. But I'm still weak. I can't help you." "It's okay, my lord. We have plenty of time. When you break free from the seal, under the influence of the great demonic tide, your power will slowly return to its peak." Ko Hua was a little embarrassed, "But I don't want to." Erek and the high-ranking members of All for One around him were startled and looked at her suspiciously. The girl lowered her eyelids slightly as if she was a little scared and replied crisply, "I don't want to participate in the war anymore. Mother promised me that that was the last time I ran before the twilight. I gave my life for Mother, so I should be free now, right?" She raised her head and looked at the others with misty silver eyes. "Can I leave?" There was a dead silence in the hall. The fourth mark. Fidesel's judgment is not necessarily accurate, but from the day of the signing, it has always been our only reliable choice. The fourth mark increases the bloodline attribute of the holder by the equivalent of 5% of a certain attribute. When the frozen stone door was pushed open, a gust of cold wind blew straight in, making everyone shrink their necks. Brando only then recovered from his thoughts. The fourth mark was a skill he obtained from the second seal of the Fool's Talent. It came from the Wisdom Dragon Crystal. This skill was a bit useless to him. Bloodline was the main attribute of a spellcaster, but his profession was a warrior. The advanced Templar Knight and the future Guard of Frost Earth had nothing to do with magic. He raised his head, and a valley of ice and snow appeared in his vision. The cold wind whistled in the valley, and the blowing snow and ice made the visibility less than 5 meters. This was the lower area of the White Canyon. Inside was a glacier from the Twilight War era caused by the body of the fallen Milos, the habitat of the Frost Devourer. However, Brando immediately felt a little strange. It was reasonable to say that when the Twilight twins died, the king of the Frost Devourer, Frostfang, should appear nearby. This was the setting in the game, but it was different here. Outside the valley, the north wind was biting cold, but there was no trace of living creatures. Be careful. Brando tightened his cloak and had to remind everyone to be vigilant. The exit of the cold walkway was located halfway up the mountain. The team slid down the steep ice wall and came to the bottom of the valley step by step. However, the monsters they imagined did not appear. The valley seemed to be empty, except for the visible world covered with ice and snow and the whistling of the wind. Veronica and the others, who had been warned in advance, looked at Brando as if they were asking. This made him a little embarrassed, but it was not easy to explain, so he kept quiet. Most of the things recorded in the literature have a certain age. Veronica took the initiative to explain to him, the location of the monster's nest is not fixed. Thousands of years is enough for them to wander to other places. Yes, there is indeed such a situation in the literature records. Shido nodded. She was an expert in this field. Brando nodded in agreement, but in fact he knew that he did not get the information from any literature at all. However, Veronica's words gave him another possibility. Contrary to their guess, the Frost Devourer had not left, but might not have come here to build a nest. After all, this was game time. Before the opening of this dungeon, the disciples of the Black Flames had not yet begun to invade this temple. In fact, there were very few people in Erewhon who knew about this ruin. If that was the case, this path would be much safer. That being said, Brando's heart was still faintly unsettled. In the game, the lower level of the White Canyon was not the first area to be discovered. The players first defeated Sheeta and entered the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator from the main entrance. After defeating the disciples of the Black Flames according to the standard process, they began to explore the fork in the temple. Then the Spiral Hall was discovered, and in turn they entered this glacier and finally found the cold walkway and the underground entrance to the Holy Cathedral. Some things in the dungeon could be permanently changed. As the order of entry was different, the challenges encountered may also be different. He was thinking about this issue when there was a commotion at the back of the team. He turned around and found that it was the huntress Peya and her brother who had awakened. Brando. A voice came in his mind. Needless to say, this was the voice of the elven lady Saint Tassol. Brando raised his eyebrows, faintly feeling that Saint Tassol was not the only one in the spiritual world. Saint Tassol's voice was a little surprised. You noticed? It seems that you are much sharper than before. The potential in your spiritual power and blood is slowly being unearthed. Compared to the hothead at the beginning, you have changed a lot. Brando knew that she was talking about the days when he had just left Butchie. From that time until the events under the silver mine in Shafland, he had never noticed that there was another soul in his spiritual world. He was indeed too slow. So who are these two? There should be two spiritual forces next to Saint Tassol, but even if he did not ask, he could vaguely guess the identity of the other party. It's Angeline and Ivan. I don't need to introduce them to you. Both Angeline and Ivan were one of Saint Tassol's personal knights. The former was once known as the Dragon Queen, and was probably the most famous female dragon knight in the history of the Mist Elves, and the latter was the commander of the Whispering Woodland Guards. Unlike the fake Orthless, this was a real expert with a bow. Hello, my name is Brando, and I am currently the successor of Lady Saint Tassol. Hello, Mr. Brando. Hello. The first was a gentle male voice and the second was a cold female voice. Their answers were also concise and to the point. Their voices were full of unique characteristics, and it was as if one could roughly understand their personalities just by listening to them. Brando suddenly remembered that Saint Tassol once said that the Hunter siblings had her keepsake. If that was the case, then the elder sister and the younger brother both had one each. This was strange. How many rings of the Wind Empress had ended up in Erewhon's hands? Logically speaking, the Ring of the Wind Empress was a national treasure of Saint Tassol. Even if it was lost, it should have ended up in powerful countries such as Cruz or Fanzan. After all, Only the nobles of these countries had the financial resources and heritage to collect this level of divine equipment. It's a little strange. Strange? How many rings of the Wind Empress have ended up in Erwin's hands? Including the one I have, there are already 3. You forgot about Williams's ring. It's now in Maynard's hands. Saint Tossol teased. That doesn't count. Brando shook his head. The elf lady then explained, I asked Elvin. The siblings' ancestors should be the descendants of the Myrna people and the Highlanders who were expelled from Saint Tossol. Brando suddenly understood. This made sense. The Myrna people had a lot of connections with the Mist Elves. Perhaps they stole the ring and escaped. Of course, it was hard to investigate this. After all, it was something that happened thousands of years ago. So, she and her brother are both your inheritors? He asked. Mr. Brando, they have the potential. But for now the sibling strength is still too weak. If it wasn't for His Majesty, we wouldn't have taken the initiative to wake up today. The one who answered was Elvin, but Brando felt that Angelique also nodded. Unless they're in danger? This time Elvin didn't answer. Only Angelique nodded again. Brando understood that Peya was lucky not to die in the ice river. It seemed that it was the Dragon Queen's doing. But what about her brother, Yeruda? Medisha and the others had examined him. Yeruda was seriously injured, and even if he was treated in time, his chances of survival would not be more than 30%. But miraculously, the wound was left at least 1 to 2 weeks ago, and it looked like it had healed naturally without receiving any treatment. Could this also be the work of the heroic souls of these elven sages? Of course this was not impossible. After all, he had experienced it once in Bucci. At that time he had activated his unyielding talent and was in a coma. He should have died anyway, but Saint Tossol the Wind Empress saved his life. But there was still a question. Why was Peya's brother under the glacier? Wasn't he with Erek and the others? That's what I wanted to tell you, Brando, the elf lady replied. I'm afraid no one can understand his experience. What? Elvin's perception was isolated for a period of time, until just now. To what extent does it take to isolate Lord Elvin's perception? Brando asked keenly. It's not difficult, that teacher of yours can do it. That is to say, it requires at least the power of the extreme realm? Brando's heart skipped a beat. The entire holy cathedral of the Hibernator should not have such a powerful existence. Does he know anything himself? This time he asked Yeruda. I've asked, the child himself doesn't know, or he feels like he's having a dream. Half asleep, he vaguely remembers a voice guiding him forward or something. Saint Tossol hesitated for a moment, but he did mention a blue shadow. A blue shadow? Brando narrowed his eyes slightly. Medisha told me the same thing. Those cruise people told her, or told Freya. Brando murmured. He looked up, the wind and snow in the glacier ahead was weaving, but the vague feeling hidden behind the fog was 1,000 times clearer at this moment. He was almost certain that something was leading them here. But it was definitely not the Frost Night King. In the dark hall, a pin drop could be heard. Until Erek broke the silence, he replied, I'm afraid not. Why? Ko Hua looked at the people in front of him, somewhat puzzled. Mother has already promised me, why are you stopping me? Erek frowned, he never expected to encounter such a situation. Ekis' eldest daughter, the ruler of the proud moon, the first wolf to bring disaster and war, was bargaining with him here like a naive little girl, asking him why he wanted to start a war? Shouldn't that be her duty? If it wasn't for the fact that there was no trace of hypocrisy in the other's pure and flawless silver eyes, he would almost think that this lord was joking with him. But the plan had already reached this step, there was no backing down or giving up. Erek exchanged glances with the all-for-one believers around him, then turned back and replied, Because you are Ekis' daughter, this is your duty. Judgment Day is coming, and you are the first wolf to wake up from the dusk. But I don't want to. Ko Hua replied timidly. I'm afraid it's not up to you, Lord Ko Hua. Erek sighed and replied gloomily. The girl was frightened by him and took a step back, but a red light net immediately flashed behind her, causing her to bump into it. This was some kind of magic seal. She struggled a little in panic and found that she couldn't break free. Being sealed for a long time had caused her strength to drop by many levels. If it were in the past, she would only need to blow a breath to break this kind of seal. But now she couldn't do anything. She turned back and looked at the others with some fear. What do you want to do? But at this time, Erek had already taken out a black crystal ball from under his robe. I didn't expect it to come in handy. To be honest, I don't want to owe those guys a favor. The Duke shook his head and raised the crystal ball. When Ko Hua saw that thing, her expression immediately changed. She stared at the annoying human in front of her with wide eyes and shouted in panic, "That's my soul fragment, why is it in your hands?" The girl's face was pale and she almost trembled. Arek's expression didn't change, but he respectfully replied, "Please forgive this one's offense, Lord Ko Hua." No. Brando was talking with Saint Ta Sol when he suddenly remembered something. He stopped talking and seemed to have fallen into his own thoughts. The elf lady in his spiritual world was keenly aware of this silence and asked, "What's wrong, Brando?" "Nothing, I just thought of something." Brando pondered for a while before answering. "What is it?" "One of Ekis' daughters is resting in this temple." "Dim Ko Hua, Ekis' eldest daughter, didn't you mention it before?" "Is that so?" Brando shook his head indifferently, but he was thinking of something else. Ko Hua had the title of Double Goddess in the game, because the battle between the players and her would repeatedly go through 2 stages. In these 2 stages, Ko Hua's temperament would also repeatedly switch between a pure and innocent girl and the evil eldest daughter of Ekis. To be honest, the kind Ko Hua had a lot of fans among the players, but this in itself wasn't surprising. Most of the boss battles in the Amber Sword were strange, and there was more than one boss with dual personalities. But the reason why he thought of this was because some people thought that Ko Hua's evil state wasn't her true nature. Among the players who had experienced Ko Hua's battles, there was a saying that when Ko Hua was in her evil state, she was actually being manipulated. But this saying didn't have any basis, and Brando once thought that it was just a self-deception by those fanatical fans. But he suddenly thought of the voice that had led everyone to the temple, the blue shadow, and couldn't help but feel a chill down his spine. That thing had signed some kind of contract with Shida in a certain era, but even Shida himself couldn't tell what kind of existence it was. Who was it and what was its purpose? Brando could only think of the title of the Awakening God. But what was the Awakening God and why did it summon them here? The more he thought about it, the more he felt that this might be a trap. But unfortunately, there was no room for retreat now, or else as long as Arek activated the star-shaped gem in his hand, everyone would turn to ashes with the forest. What kind of bad luck is this? Brando was a little speechless. Chapter 808. Hee. In the pitch-black hall, only a beam of white light shone down from the dome, illuminating the cold marble floor. Several black-robed corpses were scattered on the floor. Blood flowed out from the sword wounds on their necks, flowing along the circular grooves on the marble floor and forming a strange symbol. The scarlet blood flowed slowly, making this scene look like the evil ritual used to summon demons in legends. When the blood completely merged together, it suddenly seemed to have a life of its own. It flowed against the current, extending to the center of the magic circle and converging into the body of the elegant creature above the magic circle. In the next moment, the white wolf seemed to have gradually awakened from a long slumber. His body began to move. Then, starting from its head, its snow-white fur began to roll backward, as if a fur coat was being peeled off. First, a beautiful young girl's head was revealed. Her long hair was as dazzling as black sandalwood. Then a pair of delicate shoulders and milk-white skin were revealed. The curves of a stunner were revealed to everyone bit by bit as the fur fell off. The girl's flawless body finally appeared in front of everyone. Her eyes were tightly closed as if her soul was trapped in an eternal dream. Only the slight rise and fall of her chest proved that the eldest daughter of Ekis had not truly died. There was quite a commotion in the hall and some people even breathed heavily. Ko Hua's eyelashes shook slightly, like the stamens of a flower that had just bloomed. Then she opened her eyes, revealing a pair of silver eyes that were hazy. She got up from the ground lazily, and her long hair that was scattered on the ground was tied up, like a black waterfall flowing against the current. The girl raised her head and looked at the people in front of her with confusion. "Who are you?" Her voice was cold and charming, but it was also a little frightening. "Dim Ko Hua, the legendary eldest daughter of Ekis, the ruler of the proud moon, and also one of the 12 wolves of the twilight." It was rumored that she had died in the Battle of Babel Fortress. However, at this moment, this famous name in history was no longer a symbol that could stop children from crying. She had returned to the land of Wond, waking up from her eternal sleep. Arek took a deep breath, suppressed the excitement in his heart, and stepped forward. "Lord Ko Hua, we are all followers of the truth." "Oh," Korfa replied softly, "I see you're welcoming me back because you want to reactivate the dusk, right?" "Yes. But I'm still weak. I can't help you." "It's okay, my lord. We have plenty of time. When you break free from the seal, your power will slowly return to its peak under the influence of the great demonic tide." Ko Hua was a little embarrassed. "But I don't want to." Arek and the high-ranking members of All for One around him were startled and looked at her suspiciously. The girl lowered her eyelids slightly as if she was a little scared and replied crisply, "I don't want to participate in the war anymore. Mother promised me that that was the last time I ran before the twilight. I gave my life for Mother, so I should be free now, right?" She raised her head and looked at the others with her misty silver eyes. "Can I leave?" The hall was dead silent. The fourth mark. Fidesel's judgment is not necessarily accurate, but from the day of the signing, it has always been our only reliable choice. The fourth mark increases the bloodline attribute of the holder by the equivalent of 5% of a certain attribute. When the frozen stone door was pushed open, a gust of cold wind blew straight in, making everyone shrink their necks. Brando only then recovered from his thoughts. The fourth mark was a skill he obtained from the second seal of the Fool's Talent. It came from the Wisdom Dragon Crystal. This skill was a little useless to him. Bloodline was the main attribute of a spellcaster, but his profession was a warrior. The advanced Templar Knight and the future Guard of Frost Earth had nothing to do with magic. He raised his head, and a valley of ice and snow appeared in his vision. The cold wind whistled in the valley, and the blowing snow and ice made the visibility less than 5 meters. This was the lower area of the White Canyon. Inside was a glacier from the Twilight War era caused by the body of the fallen Milos, the habitat of the Frost Devourer. However, Brando immediately felt a little strange. It was reasonable to say that when the Twilight Twins died, the king of the Frost Devourer, Frostfang, should appear nearby. This was the setting in the game, but it was different here. Outside the valley, the north wind was biting cold, but there was no trace of living creatures. "Be careful." Brando tightened his cloak and had to remind everyone to be vigilant. The exit of the cold walkway was located halfway up the mountain. The team slid down the steep ice wall and came to the bottom of the valley step by step. However, the monsters they imagined did not appear. The valley seemed to be empty, except for the visible world covered with ice and snow and the whistling of the wind. Veronica and the others, who had been warned in advance, looked at Brando as if they were asking. This made him a little embarrassed, but it was not easy to explain, so he kept quiet. "Most of the things recorded in the literature have a certain age," Veronica took the initiative to explain to him. "The location of the monster's nest is not fixed. Thousands of years is enough for them to wander to other places." "Yes, there is indeed such a situation in the literature records." Shido nodded. She was an expert in this field. Brando nodded in agreement, but in fact he knew that he did not get the information from any literature at all. However, Veronica's words gave him another possibility. Contrary to their guess, the Frost Devourer had not left, but might not have come here to build a nest. After all, this was the game time. Before the opening of this dungeon, the disciples of the Black Flames had not yet begun to invade this temple. In fact, there were very few people in Erewhon who knew about this ruin. If that was the case, this path would be much safer. That being said, Brando's heart was still faintly unsettled. In the game, the lower level of the White Canyon was not the first area to be discovered. The players first defeated Sheeta and entered the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator from the main entrance. After defeating the disciples of the Black Flames according to the standard process, they began to explore the fork in the Holy Cathedral. Then the Spiral Hall was discovered, and in turn they entered this glacier and finally found the cold walkway and the underground entrance to the Holy Cathedral. Some things in the dungeon could be permanently changed, and with the order of entry the challenges encountered may also be different. He was thinking about this issue when there was a commotion at the back of the team. He turned around and found that it was the huntress Peya and her brother who had awakened. "Brando." A voice came in his mind. Needless to say, this was the voice of the elven lady, Saint Tassol. Brando raised his eyebrows, faintly feeling that Saint Tassol was not the only one in the spiritual world. Saint Tassol's voice was a little surprised. "You noticed? It seems that you are much sharper than before. The potential in your spiritual power and blood is slowly being unearthed. Compared to the hothead at the beginning, you have changed a lot." Brando knew that she was talking about the days when he left Butchie. From that time until the events under the silver mine in Shafland, he had never noticed that there was another soul in his spiritual world. He was indeed too slow. So who are these two? There should be two spiritual powers next to Saint Tassol, but even if he did not ask, he could vaguely guess the identity of the other party. "It's Angeline and Ivan. I don't need to introduce them to you." Both Angeline and Ivan were one of Saint Tassol's personal knights. The former was once known as the Dragon Queen, and was probably the most famous female dragon knight in the history of the Mist Elves, and the latter was the commander of the guards of the Whispering Woodland. Unlike the fake Orthless, this was a real expert with a bow. Hello, my name is Brando, and I am currently the successor of Lady Saint Tassel. Hello, Mr. Brando. Hello. The first was a gentle male voice and the second was a cold female voice. Their answers were also concise and to the point. Their voices were full of unique characteristics, and it was as if one could roughly understand their personalities just by listening to them. Brando suddenly remembered that Saint Tassel once said that the Hunter siblings had her keepsake. If that was the case, then the elder sister and the younger brother both had one each. This was strange. How many rings of the Wind Empress had ended up in Erwin's hands? Logically speaking, the ring of the Wind Empress was a national treasure of Saint Tassel. Even if it was lost, it should have ended up in powerful countries such as Cruz or Fanzan. After all, only the nobles of these countries had the financial resources and heritage to collect this level of divine equipment. It's a little strange. Strange? How many rings of the Wind Empress have ended up in Erwin's hands? Including the one I have, there are already 3. You forgot about Williams's ring. It's now in Maynard's hands. Saint Tassel teased. That doesn't count. Brando shook his head. The elf lady then explained, I asked Elvin. The siblings' ancestors should be the descendants of the Myrna people and the Highlanders who were expelled from Saint Tassel. Brando suddenly understood. This made sense. The Myrna people had a lot of connections with the Mist Elves. Perhaps they stole the ring and escaped. Of course, it was difficult to investigate this. After all, it was something that happened thousands of years ago. So, she and her brother are both your inheritors? He asked. Mr. Brando, they have the potential. But for now the sibling strength is still too weak. If it wasn't for His Majesty, we wouldn't have taken the initiative to wake up today. The one who answered was Elvin, but Brando felt that Angelique also nodded. Unless they're in danger? This time Elvin didn't answer. Only Angelique nodded again. Brando understood that Peya was lucky not to die in the ice river. It seemed that it was the Dragon Queen's doing. But what about her brother, Yeruda? Medisha and the others had examined him. Yeruda was seriously injured, and even if he was treated in time, his chances of survival would not be more than 30%. But miraculously, the wound was left at least 1 to 2 weeks ago, and it looked like it had healed naturally without receiving any treatment. Could this also be the work of the heroic souls of these elven sages? Of course this was not impossible. After all, he had experienced it once in Bucci. At that time he had activated his unyielding talent and was in a coma. He should have died anyway, but Saint Tassel the Wind Empress saved his life. But there was still a question. Why was Peya's brother under the glacier? Wasn't he with Erek and the others? That's what I wanted to tell you, Brando, the elf lady replied. I'm afraid no one can understand his experience. What? Elvin's perception was isolated for a period of time, until just now. To what extent does it take to isolate Lord Elvin's perception? Brando asked keenly. It's not difficult, that teacher of yours can do it. That is to say, it requires at least the power of the extreme realm. Brando's heart skipped a beat. The entire holy cathedral of the Hibernator should not have such a powerful existence. Does he know anything himself? This time he asked Yeruda. I've asked. The child himself doesn't know, or he feels like he's having a dream. Half asleep, he vaguely remembers a voice guiding him forward or something. Saint Tassel hesitated for a moment, but he did mention a blue shadow. A blue shadow? Brando narrowed his eyes slightly. Medisha told me the same thing. Those Cruz people told her, or they told Freya. Brando murmured. He looked up. The wind and snow in the glacier ahead was weaving, but the vague feeling hidden behind the fog was 1,000 times clearer at this moment. He was almost certain that something was leading them here. But it was definitely not the Frost Night King. In the dark hall, a pin drop could be heard. Until Erek broke the silence, he replied, I'm afraid not. Why? Ko Hua looked at the people in front of him, somewhat puzzled. Mother has already promised me. Why are you stopping me? Erek frowned. He never expected to encounter such a situation. Ekis' eldest daughter, the ruler of the proud moon, the first wolf to bring disaster and war, was bargaining with him here like a naive little girl, asking him why he wanted to start a war? Shouldn't that be her duty? If it wasn't for the fact that there was no trace of hypocrisy in the other's pure and flawless silver eyes, he would almost think that this lord was joking with him. But the plan had already reached this step. There was no backing down or giving up. Erek exchanged glances with the all-for-one believers around him, then turned back and replied, Because you are Ekis' daughter, this is your duty. Judgment Day is coming, and you are the first wolf to wake up from the dusk. But I don't want to. Ko Hua replied timidly. I'm afraid it's not up to you, Lord Ko Hua. Arek sighed and replied gloomily. The girl was frightened by him and took a step back, but a red light net immediately flashed behind her, causing her to bump into it. This was some kind of magic seal. She struggled a little in panic and found that she couldn't break free. Being sealed for a long time had caused her strength to drop by many levels. If it were in the past, she would have been able to break this kind of seal with just a breath, but now she couldn't do anything. She turned back and looked at the others with some fear. What do you want to do? But at this time, Arek had already taken out a black crystal ball from under his robe. I didn't expect it to come in handy. To be honest, I don't want to owe those guys a favor. The Duke shook his head and raised the crystal ball. When Ko Hua saw that thing, her expression immediately changed. She stared at the annoying human in front of her with wide eyes and shouted in panic, "That's my soul fragment, why is it in your hands?" The girl's face was pale and she almost trembled. Arek's expression didn't change, but he respectfully replied, "Please forgive this one's offense, Lord Ko Hua." No. Brando was talking with Saint Tassol when he suddenly remembered something. He stopped talking and seemed to have fallen into his own thoughts. The elf lady in his spiritual world was keenly aware of this silence and asked, "What's wrong, Brando?" "Nothing, I just thought of something." Brando pondered for a while before answering. "What is it?" "One of Ekis' daughters is resting in this temple." "Dim Ko Hua, Ekis' eldest daughter, didn't you mention it before?" "Is that so?" Brando shook his head indifferently, but he was thinking of something else. Ko Hua had the title of Double Goddess in the game, because the battle between the players and her would repeatedly go through 2 stages. In these 2 stages, Ko Hua's temperament would also repeatedly switch between a pure and innocent girl and the evil eldest daughter of Ekis. To be honest, the kind Ko Hua had a lot of fans among the players, but this in itself was not surprising. Most of the boss battles in the Amber Sword were strange, and there was more than one boss with dual personalities. But the reason why he thought of this was because some people thought that Ko Hua's evil state was not her true nature. Among the players who had experienced Ko Hua's battles, there was a saying that when Ko Hua was in her evil state, she was actually being manipulated. But there was no basis for such a statement, and Brendel had once thought that it was just a self-deceiving statement from those fanatical lovers. But he suddenly thought of the voice that had led everyone to the temple, the blue shadow, and couldn't help but feel a chill down his spine. That thing had signed some kind of contract with Shida in a certain era, but even Shida himself couldn't tell what kind of existence it was. Who was it and what was its purpose? Brando could only think of the title of the Awakening God. But what was the Awakening God and why did it summon them here? The more he thought about it, the more he felt that this might be a trap. Unfortunately, there was no room for retreat now, or else as long as Arek activated the star-shaped gem in his hand, everyone would turn to ashes with the forest. What kind of bad luck is this? Brando was a little speechless. Chapter 809. Until they crossed the entire glacier, the king of the Frost Devourer, Frostfang, which should have existed in the game, never appeared. There were only some frost wraiths in the snow. These undead creatures were said to be born from the souls of the travelers who had frozen to death under the glacier. They were similar to ghosts, but looked like ice demons that roamed the snow-covered forest. Fortunately, they were not very powerful, and the little female dragon, Brando, and Veronica easily dispatched them. They did not even need the Ash Sword Saint to do anything, and the Shire Trio certainly gained a lot of EXP. The small monsters in such a large-scale dungeon were also very rich in EXP and loot. It was a pity that Brando's luck had been ruined when he got the elapsing needle today. None of the dozens of frost wraiths dropped anything good, not even a high-level white equipment. Brendel felt like crying. It would have been worth it if he had gotten a whole set of elapsing needles, but it was only half of it. It was too unfair that he still had to lose some of his luck. After crossing the glacier, the team once again entered the belly of the mountain through a cave hidden in the valley. Under Brando's guidance, they turned into a long artificial corridor. It was as if a spectacular painting had suddenly appeared before everyone from the sky. It was a magnificent temple embedded in the belly of the mountain, hundreds of feet high, with arched beams opening up a towering trapezoidal space. The temple followed the architectural style of Milos's wreckage that they had seen on the surface, but beams of sky-blue light hung down from the dome of the temple like sharp swords that were hundreds of feet long, sprinkling on the blue ice, crisscrossing with the slanted beams to form disorderly and picturesque shadow patches. The temple was so majestic as if it was a giant sandwiched in the belly of the mountain, independently supporting both sides of the glacier. When they walked out of the narrow corridor, they could only feel that they were as small as dust. Everyone could not help but exclaim in their hearts. Even Brando, who had read the description in the guide, was shaken at the moment. This was the Eternal Extinction Square, and further back was the Spiral Hall. This was the creation of the civilization from the previous era. The square was still echoing with the tragic cries from that war. Then, everything fell silent, leaving only the silence of the tens of millions of years later. What's that? It was not known when the little prince had run to the front. He curiously stared at the groups of blue light balls cruising in the square below and asked, "Breath of Frost." Those were the activation spells that had been awakened from the ancient battlefield by the dark magic power. However, the number of activation spells was astonishing. From one end of the square to the other, there were at least 1,000 of them. They were scattered like stars in the night sky. Veronica couldn't help but feel a little troubled when she saw this scene. This kind of ancient activation magic was quite difficult to deal with. If there were only a few dozen of them, it would be easy to deal with, but there were thousands of them. Even if she and the Ash Sword Saint attacked together, along with the little female dragon and Brando, she was afraid that they would be drowned. Kill them directly? Veronica took a deep breath. The scene in front of her also proved that the ancient war was tragic. How dense the explosion of magic was needed to cause so many activation spells to gather here thousands of years later. There was another ancient battlefield in Wonde. That was the place where the four sages and the dark dragon had the final battle. Today that place was called the Dead Land. A large number of activation spells were active in that place, but the number was not as ridiculous as here. The battlefield spanned dozens of miles, and there were only a few hundred activation spells wandering around. But here, Veronica could not help but shake her head. I'm afraid it will take a few days to clean up all of them. We don't have that much time. The Spiral Hall is behind us. At this time, Arek and the others should be here soon. We have to be one step ahead of them. Brando immediately replied, I'll lure these things away. I'll give you a signal later and you guys will go through the square. No. Brando was slightly startled. When he turned around, he found that the ones who objected were the little female dragon and Medisha. The little female dragon looked at him up and down, and replied with some dissatisfaction. You're my toy. Before you act on your own, shouldn't you ask for the master's opinion first? Medisha, on the other hand, was more worried. My lord, your identity is different from before. There is no need to take the risk yourself. As a superior, you have to learn how to do things. Brando raised an eyebrow. Why did this line sound so familiar? He looked at the Silver Elf Princess and asked, What else did Amandina say to you? The Silver Elf Princess' face turned red. She stammered. No, this is what I wanted to say. Brando looked at the red-faced Medisha and couldn't help but find it funny. He probably didn't expect the little elven princess to have such a side. He was about to comfort her, but at this time Veronica also spoke. Her opinion was similar to Medisha's. Brando, you are not the strongest among us. The little princess is right. Leave it to me or Mephisto. Brando shrugged and directly ignored the little female dragon's previous nonsense. As for Veronica's question, he had his own opinion. In fact, it wasn't as dangerous as imagined. It was just luring the monsters. If a pure warrior who had more than 100 levels in the game didn't even know how to do this, then he might as well buy a piece of tofu and kill himself. Moreover, luring away these icy breaths here was a very famous technique. Players used to farm materials here. This was a necessary method. Although Brando hadn't personally tried it, he couldn't say that he didn't know how to do it. But it didn't mean that Mephisto or Veronica couldn't learn this technique. In fact, it wasn't difficult. The problem was that this technique required a prerequisite, and that was to be familiar with the terrain. And among everyone present, only he could reluctantly say that he was qualified to meet this condition. And there was no room for mistakes. Once surrounded by thousands of icy breaths, even Mephisto would not be able to escape easily. If that happened, it would turn into a direct battle, then there would be a lot of fun. Just like Veronica said before, it would take a few days to finish. So in the end he shook his head. Master Veronica, Master, it's not difficult to lure these monsters away. But do you know where to lure them? I know because I am more familiar with this place than you. Let me try first. Don't worry if it's troublesome, I will find a way to return. How will you return? Brando's perfunctory words obviously couldn't fool the crew's Legion commander. This lie was not easy to tell. Brando hesitated for a moment before replying, It's hard to say, I will find a way myself. Veronica stared at him suspiciously. Brando sighed and had to explain, Master Veronica, please don't worry. Do you think I am the kind of person who doesn't care about his own safety? Well, maybe I can give it a try for Erwin, but I am not that noble to work for you cruise people, so please believe me, okay? This statement finally moved the female Legion commander, although it sounded a little unpleasant. Even Prince Lenoret couldn't help but snort coldly, thinking that Brando's statement was too arrogant. Since when did the cruise people need the help of Erwin people? Veronica looked at him deeply and replied in a deliberately cold voice, "That's true. There is still a gap between a sly little guy like you and those who flaunt self-sacrifice, although you often pretend to be so bewitching." Brando couldn't help but smile bitterly. He knew that Veronica was talking about the scene that happened in the Loop of Trade Winds, but at that time he really didn't have the intention to sacrifice himself for the druids or the tree elves. He just wanted to find a way to survive in a desperate situation. He looked back and saw that most of the cruise people who were not familiar with this experience were at a loss, but a few of his subordinates were secretly laughing, especially the Silver Elf Princess, who smiled especially sweetly. But in any case, Veronica finally didn't object. He looked back again and his teacher, the Ash Sword Saint, also didn't say a word. He just nodded slightly to him and replied lightly, "Since this is what you asked for, then be careful and have more opportunities to train yourself. This is also a good thing for you." Brando raised his eyebrows. He had to admit that his teacher was also a strange person. Perhaps breaking out of the encirclement of tens of thousands of monsters was not a big deal for him. After all, he was the one who made a bloody path out of the encirclement of the central area of the Cruise Empire. There was no comparison at all. After all, there was no lack of people at Veronica's level who had participated in the ambush back then. Compared to these people, the threat of frost breath was only slightly stronger than a pet dog. Thinking of this, he shook his head and gestured to his wizard servant not far away, "The Shire, come with me." Luring monsters was a skill. Although he could do it alone, it was still a bit difficult with his current strength. It would be a different story if he had the help of a wizard. The key was that the Shire was his summoned creature. If there was any danger, he could reset him at any time. If he brought someone else with him, it would be more or less a hindrance at the critical moment. And the most important reason was that he didn't want Veronica to know some of his little secrets. In the face of his lord's summons, the Shire could only sigh. He spread his hands as if he had already expected this. Anyway, as long as it was hard work, he would be indispensable. "My lord, I didn't owe you anything in my previous life. It's hard to say, but I think I probably owe someone." Brando replied somewhat helplessly. "Someone?" The young wizard looked back and found that Brando had just taken a step when someone's hand tightly grabbed the corner of his clothes. Brando helplessly turned back and met Scarlet's bright and somewhat worried eyes. "You wait for me here, Scarlet, I'll be right back." "Oh no, it should be that we'll meet on the other side right away, okay?" Brando felt that the phrase "right away" was a bit too unlucky. Why would he come back? So he quickly changed his words. However, the red-haired girl looked at him and shook her head seriously. That was not good. The detection range of the breath of ice was about 30 feet, and the perception of the activation magic was very poor. Furthermore, his level was higher than the theoretical entry level of the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator, so Brendel only stopped when he was about 25 feet away. The Shire followed closely behind. A wizard's stealth ability was far inferior to a warrior's profession, not to mention compared to Nightingale. However, magic could solve this problem. He used the law of sound absorption to completely eliminate the sound of his footsteps, so his steps sounded lighter than Brando's. Then it was Scarlet. Brando couldn't persuade the mountain girl, so he had to let her follow. Fortunately, Scarlet's strength was not weak, and she had dragon blood. It would be difficult for her to hide her voice in front of those monsters who were good at detection, but it was not a problem for a half-deaf, half-blind thing like the frost breath. Just that, Brando looked back again and saw the sneaky faces of Alaz and Sheeta. "What are you doing here?" Brando stared at them angrily. "I'm afraid I'll lose my toy." Alaz's answer was natural. "She caught me." Sheeta replied, wanting to cry but without tears. Brando was a little speechless. If he had known, he would have just taken everyone to break out of the encirclement. These 4 or 5 people together to lure the monsters was simply a fantasy. He had to fiercely gesture to Alaz, "Listen to my command later." "What's with your attitude?" The little female dragon seemed very dissatisfied, but after a while, she added, "But if there's a reason, I can still consider it." Brando snorted softly, hiding behind the first beam, and pointed to the beam on the other side and said, "See over there, the frost breath attacks by rays with a range of about 120 feet. They move by flying with a movement speed of about 15 feet per second. However, we have 5 chances to avoid their pursuit through the beam, so if your own explosive speed can't reach more than 12 feet per second, just obediently retreat." With that he looked back at the others. But Alaz looked at him as if he was an idiot. "What are you looking at?" "Of course it's a question." Brando replied. "Are you an idiot? We're dragons." The little female dragon replied snappily, "We can run faster than you even if we walk." "Him too." Brando used his chin to point to the little fatty beside Alaz. "My lord, although I don't like to exercise, I'm still faster than you no matter what." Sheeta stuck out his little belly and replied in a low muffled voice. Brando couldn't help but touch his face, feeling that it was a bit of a blunder. The giant dragons were the golden people and a combat-oriented race. Their physical fitness was naturally not for show. He just kept the habit of being a leader and asked subconsciously but forgot about this. He looked at Scarlet again. The mountain girl did not answer, but the other party was half dragon, so naturally there was no need to say more. He had to turn his attention to the Shire. "My lord, I have a dimensional gate." The wizard servant pondered for a moment and replied with a smile. "So, I'm still the slowest?" Brando suddenly felt a little embarrassed. "Oh, more or less." The Shire looked at the others. Alaz and Sheeta were giant dragons. Scarlet could also be said to be half a dragon, and he himself had magic, so it seemed that the Lord was indeed holding them back. "How about it, little Brando?" Alaz seemed very happy to see Brando deflated and couldn't help but giggle. "Now you understand we're here to help you. Without this young lady's help, I'm afraid it will be very difficult for you to complete this mission. This is secondary. If you were to be killed by these flies, then wouldn't the toy that I had painstakingly obtained be gone? This is very bad." Brando knew that the little female dragon was deliberately going against him, as if she had been holding a grudge ever since she knew that he gave the golden apple to Scarlet. But he suddenly thought of a plan. "Alas, how about we make a bet?" "A bet?" The little female dragon narrowed her eyes, and subconsciously became a little vigilant. "Well, what I want to say is, to lead these monsters away so that others can pass, it's not as simple as you think. If you think that it's enough as long as you're fast enough, then you're gravely mistaken. And I can tell you, even if it's speed, you can't compare to me here." Brando replied, "So, I suggest that you and Sheeta go back and act with the others, and leave this to the professional personnel department." "Don't give me that, I'm not going to be provoked by you." Alaz snorted. "But how do you want to bet?" Brando snickered. This little female dragon did not mean what she said, and he had already experienced it. He quickly replied, "Didn't I say, let's compete in speed to see who gets to the finish line first? Competing in speed with the dragon race?" Alaz's eyes widened. "Are you crazy?" Brando nodded seriously. "The loser must unconditionally agree to a condition of the winner." "A condition?" The little female dragon was slightly startled, and suddenly hugged her chest, her little face red, and shouted with some anger. "What are you trying to do, shameless? F***ck, what are you thinking about?" Brendel almost screamed when he saw the little female dragon like this. He hurriedly put up a finger and gestured for her to keep quiet. Then he poked his head out to take a look. Fortunately, the icy breaths that were cruising outside did not seem to notice the noise here at all. It was indeed worthy of the title of being half deaf and half blind. He breathed a sigh of relief, turned back, and scolded Alaz angrily. "Are you crazy? Do you want to die here?" Alaz looked at him hatefully, showing her fangs, and retorted, "Who told you to make such a shameful request?" "How is it shameful?" Brando suddenly saw the Shire and Sheeta's strange expressions, as well as Scarlet's blushing face. He wanted to strangle this stupid little female dragon to death. "I mean, if I win, you have to give me the real heart of the dragon." When Brando said this, he paused for a moment. After all, the heart of the dragon was the secret treasure of the dragon clan, and he did not know how valuable it was to the dragon clan. It was just that Princess Magadol needed to rely on the heart of the dragon to revive, so he came up with this idea in a hurry. Sure enough, as soon as he opened his mouth, Sheeta hurriedly shook his head. "The heart of the dragon is mine." But unfortunately, Alaz looked at him suspiciously and asked, "That's it?" "I agree, Sister Alaz." The little fat dragon widened his eyes. "It's okay, you can join in too." Alaz patted her cheap brother's shoulder and said casually, "This way, if he loses, he owes each of us a request." "You can do that?" The Shire was stunned, and he quickly raised his hand. "Then I'll join in too." Brando looked on coldly, watching his young wizard servant digging his own grave, and could not help but sneer in his heart. But he was also curious and asked, "What kind of wager do you want?" Because in Brando's impression, the Shire seemed to be the kind of person who was indifferent and carefree. Unless it was necessary for magic research, he did not seem to have any other desires. That's nothing, but I think it's cool, isn't it? Think about it, your master owes you a request, it's so dirty and unreasonable. The Shire could not help but answer with a smile. Damn, Brando was speechless at his servant's strange idea. But when he turned around he saw Scarlet's face was red, and she raised her hand. You want to join in too? Yes. Damn. For a moment, Brando could not help but have such a thought in his mind. This was indeed very dirty and unreasonable. Chapter 8:10. Happy Birthday, Kitty? Blackie's new book, Calamity Descends, will be on the shelves on National Day. Everyone who is short on books can go and take a look. If you like it, you can also subscribe and give monthly tickets. In addition, you don't have to worry about the updates of the book anymore. It may not be 100% stable every day, but it certainly won't be a monthly update. Equals a smiley face. While Brando was making his bet, Duke Arek and his party had already passed through the central maze under the lead of Ko Hua. The road ahead was getting wider and wider, gradually forming a cave-like corridor inside the mountain. Those corridors were hundreds of feet high, and the pillars with a diameter of more than 30 feet supported the pillars that looked like the ribs of giant beasts. Looking up, these majestic pillars were embedded into the walls on both sides. The hall was not empty. The prehistoric battle had extended to this place, causing the empty walkway to be filled with skeletons of all sizes. These skeletons were still in the state of battle when they were alive. It was as if a tragic battle had been interrupted by a sudden disaster, and all the participants were frozen in the last moment of their lives. The bones filled the entire space, forcing Arek and the others to meander through the gaps between them. He was bypassing a skeleton with wings. The skeleton was still wearing a half-body armor covered with silver wings, but the armor that used to shine had lost its magic brilliance and turned into a pile of rusty copper and iron. This was the corpse of a divine servant, a seraph. This kind of golden race was completely wiped out in the Battle of Ebabel. The remaining few people hid outside the elemental frontier and disappeared with the gods. Today there were still some secondary divine descendants in Wond, but compared with these terrifying and beautiful creatures, they were not the best among the silver race. Duke Arek noticed the skeleton of the giant wolf that fought with the seraph. The third vertebra of the skeleton's skull was obviously white. This was a typical third-generation Twilight wolf, the offspring of Fenrir. They and their ancestors had been imprisoned by the divine people, and the place where they were chained was left with a permanent mark that went deep into the bone marrow. Arek withdrew his gaze from these skeletons and narrowed his eyes. Where is this place? The promenade of meditation. Where does it lead to? The place you want to go. Arek turned around. Beside Devard, Ekis' eldest daughter was shrouded in a black robe. The surface of the robe had some scarlet patterns, and the black fabric made her skin shine like snow. The hood was so deep that only her sharp chin could be seen. However, the pair of red eyes shone in the shadows, and the cold glint could still be clearly felt. When Arek did not speak, Ko Hua pursed her lips and did not say a word. Ever since she absorbed the other half of the soul fragment, she had become like this. She was no longer as pure and innocent as before. However, only when Arek looked away would the girl's face reveal a pained expression. She frowned. Arek could faintly feel that the eldest daughter of Ekis had not forgotten everything. Those stinking demons from the Sulphur River gave him her soul fragment and told him that this thing could make the unruly Ko Hua obedient. However, the latter was neither unruly nor obedient. Although she did calm down and lead them out of the maze. Lady Ko Hua. Arek thought for a moment and spoke with a hoarse voice. Ko Hua looked at him. Do you still remember what happened in this war? What does this have to do with you? I just want to pay my respects to that great war. The girl raised her head and looked around the hall with cold eyes. This is Main's subordinate. When the offspring of Fenrir attacked the promenade of meditation, they collided with the 7th Legion of the Seraphs. They fought here, as you can see. And then? There is no then. The dying Milos activated the central core, and the light of death shrouded the entire battlefield in an instant. Main, Mare, and I, as well as the third column of the No Race and their commander, were forever frozen at this moment. The Frost Giants lost their father forever, and the Twilight Legion also suffered heavy losses. The central core? It should still be somewhere around here, but you can rest assured that it should also be severely damaged and will no longer pose a threat to you. Arek nodded and no longer spoke. However, there was a rare surge in his calm heart. He could imagine what kind of war it was. The No Race, the offspring of Fenrir, the Seraphs, the Frost Giants, the most terrifying names of the ancient era were all turned into dust in an instant. Even an existence like Ko Hua was no exception. This was the Twilight Legion. Thinking of this, he could not help but respectfully bow his head. Lady Ko Hua, please forgive us for our previous offense. It's fine. Under Ko Hua's hood, there was no fluctuation in her blood-red eyes. She glanced at the human in front of her without joy or worry. But in the depths of her eyes, there was a blazing light. Perhaps even Brando would not know that the Central Defense Corps of the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator had such a glorious past. In his memory it was just one of the bosses in the Holy Cathedral, and its strength was not even as strong as the Twilight Gemini's battle. The core was located in one of the halls in the central labyrinth. Before the players reactivated it, it would only be silent under the dust forever, and even the central core in its activated state was nothing more than that. And at this moment, Brando was fulfilling his bet. Wait, Allah's voice was hurried, but it was very pleasant to the ears. She stared at Brando. You are not allowed to use that thing you got earlier. So she still remembers the elapsed needle. At least you're not that stupid. I'm not crazy enough to burn experience points for a bet. Brendel thought to himself, you're not that stupid. Other items can't be used either, Alaz added. You're too nosy. Is this how you make a bet? You're trying to cheat. Alaz revealed a pair of sharp canine teeth, as if she would bite Brando if he did not agree. Brando had to raise his hands and surrender. Okay, you have the final say. The little female dragon was smug, feeling that she had prevented Brando from being sneaky. With her own ability, she did not think that Brando could get ahead of her. She was a dragon, and the strongest of the dragons, the gold dragon. Although she was not as fast as the blue dragon, she would not lose to a human. But immediately she knew how big a mistake she had made. It turned out that the core of this bet was to pass through the monsters, and not simply to compare who was faster. The little female dragon realized this with despair. Thousands upon thousands of icy breaths, even a dragon wouldn't dare to touch them lightly. Every time she wanted to move forward, those little bits of revitalizing spells gathered together like a wall, blocking her way forward. Alaz naturally did not dare to dive in like this. She had no choice but to go around. Fortunately, Brando pointed out 6 pillars to them that could be used to bypass these revitalizing spells, otherwise the little female dragon would have gone crazy. If she did not follow the route pointed out by Brando, she found that she could not move forward even half a step. However, the cunning human was able to slip through the gaps between the monsters every time. Even at such a close distance, only a few frost rays hit him. For the sake of fairness, each of them had the Shire's frost barrier on them, and these few frost rays hit Brando. It had no effect at all. Damn, there's a constant dimensional anchor in this place. The Shire's strange cry came from nowhere. In short, except for Scarlet, the remaining 1 person and 2 dragons were somewhat crying. The young wizard servant finally knew why his lord looked at him with a smile that was not a smile. It turned out that he was looking for his own death. However, he couldn't figure out how his lord knew that there was such an obscure enchantment spell like dimensional anchor in this place. Brando was laughing secretly. Alaz would never understand what the problem was. In fact, before someone invaded, the frost breaths were naturally distributed throughout the square. Since it was naturally distributed, the huge amount of frost breaths could not lie evenly on every inch of the ground. And the fact was that before being stimulated by external objects, most of these revitalizing spells were actually grouped together in groups of 3 or 5, but because there were too many of them, it looked like the whole square was everywhere. In other words, there were still 1 or 2 fixed cutting routes. These classic cutting routes were also summed up by the previous players from repeated failures. Only after thousands of failures could a pattern be found. And no matter how smart or talented Alaz was, it was impossible to find the only correct path among thousands of frost breaths at a glance. But Brando could. This was the advantage of having an information lead, or cheating. He took the lead and cut into the only correct route, and then broke into the group of frost breaths, like poking a hornet's nest. Although Brando's speed was not too fast or too slow, it could be said to be just right, almost blocking the reaction speed and shooting distance of the frost breaths, so these revitalizing spells were almost helpless against the fly that passed between them. But have you ever seen an angry bee swarm? These frost breaths were the same at present. Although their reaction was very slow, once they moved, the huge number was extremely terrifying, especially when Brando deliberately disrupted their pace, causing them to jam together behind him. Countless revitalizing spells were in a mess behind Brando, and Alaz, Sheeta, and the Shire, who were also behind Brando, could only grit their teeth at this moment. Before the frost breaths moved, they could not find the path through them, let alone after they moved. In front of them, the frost breaths were like restless waves, and anyone who wanted to plunge headfirst into them would probably end up with nothing left of their bones. Alaz walked forward for this distance and could only stop and stomp her feet. "Brando, you damn cunning human!" The little female dragon waved her claws and roared at Brando's back from afar. Brando pretended not to hear. He was bypassing the last pillar, and at the same time threw 2 stones into the 2 piles of frost breaths not far away. This action was no different from poking a hornet's nest, and the revitalizing spells over there immediately fell into a frenzy and chased in his direction. He looked back again, and the revitalizing spells in the middle and front of the hall had been left behind by him for a long time. Except for the sporadic attention attracted by Alaz and the Shire, most of them were led in his direction. If he remembered correctly, there were 2 exits to the north of the Eternal Extinction Square, and the eastern exit led to the central maze. He intended to lead these frost breaths there first. But there was a problem here. First, there were 2 giant revitalizing spells at the exit. With his current speed, it was difficult to avoid the opponent's attack. Second, after these revitalizing spells were led over, how could he turn back? It was not that there was no way in the game, but he was a warrior, not a nightingale known for her agility. In fact, this was the difficulty of the whole monster luring technique, but Brando knew that most of the techniques of that era had some flaws. For example, he himself had modified a lot of meaningless action paths. For himself, he was still very confident. After all, he was a warrior with a pure profession over level 100. If his agility was not enough, he would rely on experience to make up for it. Looking back again, the frost breaths clustered together were closer, but the huge number limited their forward speed. Brando estimated that the revitalizing spells on the left and right were a bigger threat to him. In fact, at this time, several cold rays were shot at him from both sides, but Brando gently leaped and let all the attacks fall behind him. He crossed the hall horizontally and came near the last pillar. He raised his head, and the eastern exit was close at hand. Near the exit in that direction, there were 2 giant revitalizing spells. Those things looked like an enlarged version of the frost breaths, each at least 60 or 70 feet in diameter. Around their bodies there were some dazzling blue spots like orbiting satellites, but Brando knew that it was their attack method, so he deliberately avoided some. But in any case, in the end he still had to pass through the middle of the 2 frost breaths. There was no shortcut, he could only rely on the county. He immediately sank his consciousness into the world of his mind and ordered, "The county." The long line of people in black robes stopped in front of a quaint door. The door was also made of the obsidian material that could be seen everywhere here, but it was covered with star-like textures. In the center of the door, the stars surrounded a star, and there was only a groove left in the position of the star. Everyone looked up at the giant door, which was 120 feet high. There were 2 skeletons by the door, each holding an ice-blue giant axe, their heads hanging down, and their helmets split in 2. "These are the frost giant forbidden guards?" Devard's voice hissed. Erek nodded. "We're here?" "Behind this is the spiral hall," Kohua replied coldly. The Duke turned his head, and the black-robed knight of All for One came into his sight. "Find a way to open this door, and the others guard this hall." He took a breath and his heart finally stirred. The plan had finally reached the last step and success was in sight. But Erek suddenly narrowed his eyes and noticed that the promenade of meditation led to a dark corridor. He glanced over there and asked, "What direction is that?" The hall was silent, and no one answered his question. He had to turn his head to Ekis' eldest daughter. The latter looked at him silently. "Eternal Extinction Square. Where is that?" "I don't know." Kohua shook her head as if she really didn't know. "You don't know?" "But I know that the main brothers escaped in that direction." "Why, you don't believe me?" Kohua looked at Erek with her blood-red eyes, and her eyes were calm without the slightest fluctuation. Alec furrowed his brows. "Devard," he ordered, "take some people there and have a look." Kohua didn't seem to care about the other's order. She turned her head and quietly looked at the giant obsidian door in front of her. Chapter 8:11. Freya woke up groggily from the cold. However, she was no longer in a glacial valley that looked like layers of ice blades. She could no longer hear the low whistling of the icy wind in the valley. She remembered that when she fainted, she was on the windward side of the glacier. Now she was in a valley with a calm wind. She did not know how long she had been unconscious. The cold seemed to have seeped into her limbs and bones. She gritted her teeth and struggled to get up from the snow. However, Freya suddenly noticed something that she had never seen before. Not far from her wobbling vision stood a small creature. It looked a little like a small snowman, but its slender arms were not made of dry branches. Instead they were made of ice crystals. The little creature placed its hands on its waist and bent over to look at Freya. It looked a little like the butler in the seigneur's castle. However, it was not tall. Its face was covered with a beard and eyebrows that looked like ice crystals. Under the eyebrows, a pair of bright eyes shone brightly. Freya was shocked. She had never seen such a thing before. She immediately woke up and sat up in the snow like a spring. However, she did not expect that her sudden movement would scare the snowman. The little creature was so scared that it took 2 steps back and tripped on a tree root. It then fell on its butt in the snow. It took a long time for it to get up. Then the two of them stared at each other. There was an awkward silence in the snow. After a long while, Freya finally realized that the snowman did not seem to be hostile. She pondered for a moment and asked tentatively, "Did you bring me here?" The snowman was startled. It quickly patted the snow off its body and stood up. It bowed respectfully to Freya and said, "No, it was not me. It was my master who brought you here, my dear young mistress." It could even speak Crew's language. However, its intonation was a little weird. It sounded like a duck quacking, which was very funny. Freya's mouth opened in an O shape. She was shocked by the way the snowman addressed her. "Wait, what did you call me? Who's your master?" "Master is master, respected little master." The snowman answered in a matter-of-fact tone, as if that was the correct answer to this question. "Wait, I'm not a little master. Did you get the wrong person? Master said that you are the most distinguished guest here. Master told us to treat you with the etiquette of a young master. Master said so, so master must be right." Freya felt that her brain was not enough. She only felt that if Brando was here, he would be able to figure out what was going on quickly. However, the girl from the countryside of Bucci was not stupid. She first touched the side of her belt, where the Lionheart sword was still in its scabbard. She then touched her waist pouch, where the slate Brando had given her was also intact. Even the ruby ring was still on her finger. She heaved a sigh of relief. This meant that the other party had no ill intentions. She calmed down a little. After a while, she asked the snowman, "Hello, how should I address you?" The snowman put one of his withered hands on his chest and bowed at her like a human being. "We are the Talifen sprites who have lived here for generations. My honorable little master, we do not have names. You can call us Hey, or Come Here. After all, we all look the same to you, but there are actually some differences. You only need to count our beards and eyebrows carefully, and you will find that there are more and less of them, and their shapes are not the same either." Before Tolfin finished its introduction, Freya burst into laughter. The little thing was imitating the etiquette of the human nobles, but its words were irrelevant. It was a little funny. She held back her laughter and asked, "Where is your master?" "Master is in the house." "House? Can I see him?" "Master said that if you wake up, little master, I should take you to see him." "Take me to see him?" Freya was a little suspicious. "Can I see him now?" Tolfin nodded. Freya stood up in the snow and patted the corner of her clothes, only to realize that she had recovered from her injuries. She remembered that she was seriously injured before she passed out and killed the silver monster with the last blow. She could not remember what happened at that time. She only vaguely remembered that the slate in her bag fell out and glittered in the snow, and she was in pain as if she had fallen into a furnace. Then she passed out. However, the stone slab was still in her waist pouch. She pinched it with her hand and it was as cold as before. There was no change at all. Freya did not know if the recovery of her injuries had something to do with the changes at that time or the mysterious master of these fairies, but she saw that the little snowman had climbed to the mouth of the valley in front of her. It stood under a snow-white thorn bush and waved at her. Freya hurried to follow it. Freya found that she seemed to be in a secluded valley. She followed Tolfin through a dense forest of white thorns that she had seen before. The whole valley seemed to be covered with this kind of plant. These white thorns could grow very high, just like the trees outside, except that the top of the thorns bent down and hung glowing fruits. Like street lamps, the soft light illuminated the winding path in the forest. There were many animals in the white forest. Freya saw a type of squirrel with grayish-white fur. It was searching for shrubs and seeds under the thorny bushes. Occasionally, it would pass through the path in a group, or it would look at her with its big black eyes, wary of an outsider. On the thorns above her head, there were many birds that looked like sparrows, but these birds had silver feathers and long tail feathers. They were not afraid of strangers at all, and let Freya and the fairies walk under them. Instead, they tilted their heads and looked at the uninvited guest. After walking for a while, the white thorns suddenly separated to the left and right. Freya's eyes lit up slightly, and a look of surprise appeared on her face. After the thorns separated, A mountain spring surrounded by the forest appeared behind. The mountain spring hung down from the rock wall and fell into a pool. Steam rose from the pool. It was obviously a hot spring formed by geothermal heat. But this wasn't enough to surprise her. She saw that the ground beside the hot spring was covered with emerald green vegetation and meadows. And on the meadow there was a blue stag lying down. The stag obviously noticed her too. Freya did not know if she was hallucinating, but she saw the stag looking at her with a kind expression. This made her recognize the stag immediately. It was the stag that led them out of the predicament the night before. She seemed to have understood something, but at this moment Tolfin, who was leading the way, stopped and turned back to look at Freya. The surprised girl looked ahead and saw that the white thorny trees had come to an end. In front of them was an open space in front of a mountain wall. A man-made structure was carved out of the mountain wall, forming an arch that was as tall as 3 or 4 people. Freya looked at the arch and then at Tolliver, who had stopped, and asked, "Do you want me to go in?" The snowman nodded. Freya had to pluck up her courage and take a few steps forward into the cave. The light around her dimmed, but after adapting to the dim environment, she gradually saw the interior of the cave. Behind the arch was a natural cave, as if the man-made hatchet marks on the outside were just to decorate the entrance of the cave. Like most glacial caves here, the walls of the cave were made of smooth ice, but the cave was not deep. It extended for 20 or 30 feet before it stopped abruptly, cut off by a vertical ice wall. Freya could not help but widen her eyes. Where was the master that the little sprite mentioned? There was nothing in the cave. But just as she was puzzled, the ice wall in front of her suddenly melted and formed a small door, and then a voice said, "Please come in, Miss Freya." "You know me?" Freya asked, startled. But the voice did not answer. Freya was nervous and curious. She was actually very worried about the safety of Brando, Maynard, and the little prince at the moment, but she did not know where she was. She waited for a while and saw that the voice had no intention of continuing, so she had to bend down and pass through the small door in the ice wall. The thick ice wall was about 10 feet thick. After passing through the small door, she suddenly felt a light in front of her, and the surrounding temperature rose a few degrees. It was not as cold as before in the valley, but there was a warm atmosphere. Freya looked up in surprise and found that behind the ice wall was a very comfortable room. It was like the study rooms of the nobles she had seen in Ampere Seal. There was a table, a high-backed chair, a bookshelf, a fireplace, a thick carpet on the floor, and a bright flame burning in the fireplace. The bookshelf was full of books and there were silver candlesticks and plates on the table. The candlelight was soft, and the plates were filled with all kinds of food. The food was steaming hot as if it had just been taken out of the oven. The room was empty, but someone automatically pulled out a chair for Freya and put a plate and fork on it, as if inviting her to take a seat. "Please have a seat." That voice rang out once more. Freya knew that if she did not do as the other party said, the voice would probably ignore her again. She hesitated for a moment and sat down. Immediately, a white porcelain teacup automatically flew down from the shelf next to her and placed in front of her. Then, the silver teapot on the table seemed to be held up by an invisible hand, tilted slightly, and poured tea for her. The tea was a beautiful red like the onyx in the cup. Freya was a little nervous. She put her hands on her knees and suddenly remembered what she had learned in etiquette class. She said subconsciously, "Thank you." The voice seemed to have seen through the girl from the countryside of Bucci and couldn't help but laugh. "Don't be nervous," he said, "don't be nervous. It's been a long time since we entertained guests here." Freya took a deep breath. She didn't know what he meant by, "It's been a long time since we entertained guests." Did it mean that this place used to entertain guests? Or did it mean something else? She asked, full of doubts, "Hello, are you the owner of this place? Did you save me?" "We'll talk about this later. Try the tea I made first," the voice replied gently. Drinking something of unknown origin in a completely unfamiliar place was not a wise thing to do, but Freya felt that there was no need for the other party to do this. She hesitated for a moment, but still patiently picked up the white porcelain teacup and took a sip. The black tea was very delicious. It had a strong taste of milk. After entering her mouth, she felt as if all the fatigue in her body had disappeared. Even the soreness from sleeping in the snow had disappeared without a trace. But she was not in the mood to drink tea. She only took a sip and put down the cup with both hands with a heavy heart. "How is it?" the voice asked. "And very good. Thank you for your hospitality," Freya said, choosing her words carefully. "You seem to be very worried?" Freya was not an idiot. She could now confirm that the other party was the owner of this place. "Because I don't know where this place is. I'm very confused." "This is just a place, because it is not fundamentally different from other places. If you seriously consider this question, you will realize that it is not important to you, right? The voice replied. Freya felt that this statement was very strange, but it could not be said that it was wrong. What she really cared about was not where she was, but how far away she was from Brando and Maynard. She nodded honestly. Yes, I'm worried about my companions. I've been separated from them. Sorry, I'm not saying this to trouble you, but can you help me get out of here? She paused. Or you can ask the sprites. No need to rush, the voice said. Miss Freya, no need to rush. I let each of you here because I want you to do me a favor. You are the one leading us. Freya thought of the stag she saw outside the door and could not help but believe it. But who are you and how can we help you? My power is very weak, but it is not difficult to lead you here because I know why you are here, so I just need to tell you the direction. The voice laughed. Long story short, after all, I don't have much time left. Let me introduce myself first. My name is Milandal, according to the Kurlut's name Milos. The teacup in Freya's hand fell on the tray. She did not even notice the tea splashing on the tablecloth. Before coming here she had never even heard of this name. But soon this name was deeply engraved in her memory, just like the glaciers and wind in this forest. Brendel's words echoed in her heart again and again, shocking her to the point where her jaw dropped. You are right. I am the first frost giant in this world. They call me father and you humans call me God. I accept all these titles because I am qualified to do so. But, Freya wanted to say, but ever since the stars fell to the ground, the gods had already left this world. Legend had it that they left with the Twilight Dragon and never returned. Although people had built many shrines to them in Vaunt to commemorate the era when gods and humans coexisted, everyone knew that the era of mortals had long since arrived. But she couldn't bring herself to say it out loud. She was stunned by the sudden news. Are you confused? The voice seemed to know what she was thinking. Freya calmed herself down and nodded. Actually, you don't have to be so surprised. Milos has already fallen. I am just a myth left behind by a great will. Myth? People's thoughts will repeatedly linger on the question they wanted to solve the most when they were alive. This myth will occasionally become a ghost-like existence, but if your existence is too strong, this kind of thinking will become substantial, like an existence like me, the voice replied gently. Are you saying that there is a problem that is bothering you? But shouldn't gods be omniscient and omnipotent? Perhaps only Lady Martha can be omniscient and omnipotent. We just think more than you. But my myth has nothing to do with you. It is just unnecessary trouble. But today I want you to do me a favor. Freya, this matter is not only related to me but also to you and your companions and the young master of Valhalla. I know him, don't I? Brando? Freya was so shocked that she almost stood up. The voice did not answer, but Freya had a strange feeling that the other party nodded silently. What do you want me to do? Freya could only ask cautiously. Although she felt that there must be some kind of mistake, how could she help with a problem that even the gods were troubled by? The room was silent for a moment. I want you to stop my resurrection. After a while, the voice slowly spoke. What? Freya bounced up from the chair as if she had been electrocuted. It was as if she had heard the most unbelievable thing since she was born. Her face was full of shock. What did you say? Stop my resurrection, Freya. That great will is gradually waking up from the darkness. You don't understand what will happen, but for the entire Wond, this is an unpredictable fate. The era of gods has ended. This has nothing to do with the myth. I don't know the answer to that question, but the Knight of Azure has given you an answer. This answer can no longer be changed, Freya. P.S. I continue to recommend Idiot Sunspot's new book, Calamity Descends. Speaking of which, this one has been doing quite well in the past few days. This one will continue to work hard. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.